Hello, and welcome to Entangled, the podcast where we explore the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being having a human experience. I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, and last episode I interviewed Stephanie Garay, the mother of Maddie Garay. If you haven't already listened to that episode, I recommend starting there, as this is the outro extenuation of that episode, which I split into multiple episodes due to length. In episode 30, Stephanie described how her 3 children enrolled in Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine trials. In late 2020, in an effort to help the global pandemic come to an end and to facilitate a return to normalcy for their family. Immediately after her daughter Maddie's second vaccine, she suffered a number of serious adverse events. Instead of helping Maddie heal from the injuries and truthfully reporting what happened to the FDA, Maddie's doctors and the trial sponsor Pfizer suppressed her story. They gaslit her, ignored her, and even tried to shut her up in a psychiatric ward. Meanwhile, Maddie's injuries continued to get worse because she could not receive appropriate treatments, as no one would acknowledge her injuries were due to the vaccine, despite the abundance of evidence that they were a direct result. Unfortunately, Maddie's story is just one of the tens of thousands, at least, who've had their vaccine injuries suppressed. The story of vaccine injury suppression itself is just one part of a much larger story of COVID-19 corruption and criminal conspiracy. What follows is an introduction to that larger story. Outro available for this and all episodes at entangledpodcast.substack.com. Music from the show available on the Spotify playlist Entangled The Vibes. Please enjoy the episode. COVID-19 corruption, the destruction of public health, and ideas to regenerate it. I started episode 30 talking about the dangers of censorship. One of its deepest problems is that censorship reduces complicated topics, like the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, to black and white. You're either pro-science and safety, or you're anti-vax and spreading medical misinformation. It also enables the organizations who control information flow to dismiss anyone who alleges corruption as the most exotic of conspiracy theorists. The censors conflate the story to the point where saying Bill Gates and his foundation experienced significant financial gains as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic somehow becomes the equivalent of saying Bill Gates is a shape-shifting reptilian from the Draco star system. We must learn to practice discernment. There is real corruption. There are real conspiracies. Yet we've created a society that promotes coincidence theorists, those who dismiss allegations of corruption as mere coincidence before reviewing the evidence. Unfortunately, there are modern-day robber barons running the global political and economic system. These men and women, time and time again, have prioritized their own wealth and power over the health and prosperity of humankind. There are a lot of topics we discussed in episode 30 that defy the official narrative of the COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to summarize exactly what I think is the most likely, truthful depiction of events, both in the years preceding the pandemic and during the pandemic. I want to highlight that these are not Stephanie's views, but my own. I encourage everyone to poke holes in my arguments and to show me where I've misinterpreted events. But please, can we talk about it? Democracy ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. Part 1. Alleged corruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. The specific allegations I'll be making in this essay are as follows. Number 1, there is a COVID cabal, a secret group of conspirators who pre-planned and coordinated the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus outbreak. This cabal includes corrupt regulators, politicians and lobbyists, big pharma executives, principal investigators, global intelligence agents, big media executives and journalists, and big tech executives. Number 2, the coronavirus was most likely manipulated through gain-of-function research to accelerate its viral evolution. The leak occurred at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which had received funding from the Anthony Fauci-controlled National Institute of Health, and the virus was most likely leaked intentionally. As evidence started to surface, the lab leak theory was vehemently denied and censored. The outbreak was instead blamed on an individual in Wuhan eating a bat, despite the lack of evidence supporting this theory. The COVID-19 planning and response is therefore an example of a false flag attack or an operation committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on another party. I suspect the US will subsequently blame the outbreak on the Chinese government, the Chinese will blame it on the US government, and the military intelligence industrial complexes controlling each will use the pandemic as further justification for war. Number 3, the pre-planned response to the pandemic, coordinated through events like Event 201 in October 2019, had ulterior motives from the outset. Ensuring the health, safety, and prosperity of humans around the world was by no means a priority or even a desired outcome by the COVID cabal. Rather, the nefarious intentions of the pandemic included the redistribution of wealth from individuals and small businesses to pharmaceutical companies and other multinational corporations owned by the cabal, and increasing censorship, surveillance, and state control over civil liberties by inciting fear amongst the public as part of an overarching mission. This mission is to drive the world towards a one-world centralized totalitarian regime, the New World Order. A few sub-bullets on the New World Order, which Wikipedia is of course quick to dismiss as conspiracy theory nonsense. The idea of a cabal driving towards a one-world government appears so unbelievable and conspiratorial that it's easy to dismiss. I wouldn't have believed the existence of this nefarious plot myself even 1 year ago. But as I took an honest look at the evidence, I've come to accept that the most parsimonious explanation is that there is in fact a transnational, organized crime syndicate at the center of global power. At the center of the cabal, control has consolidated to likely no more than 100 powerful families and individuals, predominantly wealthy white men from Western Europe and North America. Some of the most important institutions controlled by the cabal include the Council on Foreign Relations, the Federal Reserve System, unacknowledged special access programs within the military intelligence industrial complex, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the World Health Organization, and the World Economic Forum. This is the web of organizations collectively known in pop culture as the Deep State, and yes, unfortunately, it is real. I don't like it any more than you do, but pretending it doesn't exist won't help find a solution for the problem. This cabal has executed a plan over decades at least, more likely centuries, to develop a global order dominated by corporatocracy. Corporatocracy refers to the highly corrupt network of corporations, banks, colluding governments, media outlets, and the rich and powerful people tied to them who are in control of the global financial and governmental infrastructure today. How the cabal developed this system of corporatocracy is complicated, nuanced, and highly secretive, but the crux of their plan centers around, number 1, controlling the economic system, number 2, controlling the global energy grid, and number 3, controlling how we perceive reality. As it relates to controlling our perception of reality, the cornerstone that ties together many of the cabal's nefarious activities relates to their suppression of the unified field of consciousness, or the knowledge that consciousness itself is the foundation of the universe. The cabal, corporatocracy, and the suppression of the unified field of consciousness. Back to COVID-19, allegation number 4 is that the leaders of the COVID-19 response, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates, convinced the world that they are heroes who sprung into action during a time of crisis. In reality, both men are at best con men who deceived the world, putting their personal financial gain over the health and prosperity of billions. At worst, they are sociopathic sadists who conduct illegal experiments on vulnerable populations like foster children and children in third world countries, and who support the forced sterilization of target populations. These are not allegations I make lightly and will discuss further in parts 2 and 3. Number 5, effective, cheap, early treatment protocols for COVID-19 infection, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, were purposely suppressed by the COVID cabal. This resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths that could have been avoided. Instead, the pandemic response focused entirely on untested, expensive vaccines and new patentable treatments like remdesivir, in which NIAID and Gates had direct financial interests. Number 6, the cabal, through their control of the media and the medical establishment, systematically suppressed vaccine-injured patients and frontline responders advocating for early treatment protocols. Further, once COVID-19 vaccines had been developed, they were strongly pushed and even mandated to all demographic groups. This includes those who the vaccines clearly caused more harm than good, including children, who have much higher risk of adverse event from vaccines than from infection of the disease. And number 7, COVID-19 was not the end game, but rather just a stepping stone in the cabal's move toward global consolidation. The people and organizations behind the COVID cabal intend to use future pandemics and false flags to push their agenda of fear, state control, and pharmacological obedience. These are tactics which we're already seeing play out with the exaggerated threat of monkeypox. In part 2, I'll provide a timeline of the events leading up to the pandemic and evidence of corruption throughout the pandemic. I'll predominantly leverage the research from Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. Kennedy's impeccable research shows how the COVID-19 corruption was orchestrated from the top down. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the son of Attorney General Robert Kennedy and nephew of President John F. Kennedy. He is a lawyer and journalist who rose to prominence for his role in environmental activism and preserving the Hudson River. Following his environmental work, he reluctantly got involved in exposing pharmaceutical corruption, specifically the suppression of vaccine-injured patients, starting in 2005. Now, if you ask Wikipedia, RFK Jr. is an author known for promoting anti-vaccine propaganda and conspiracy theories. The real reason he's subjected to this invective is because he's well-researched, he's well-spoken, and he's fearless. And as a general rule of thumb, the quicker Wikipedia advises you to dismiss a person or idea, the more important it is we explore those ideas. Also, there is a global conspiracy, and we have been systematically lied to about vaccines. These are both unpopular opinions, and I've had a difficult time confronting these uncomfortable truths. But once we get past the mental roadblock of not wanting them to be true, the evidence in support of both is unimpeachable. From there, I'll highlight Maddie Garay's story to show how this corruption was specifically damaging to her and the overall well-being of the Garay family. You'll note that a quick Google search of the whistleblowers I highlight, like RFK Jr., Dr. Robert Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough, and Dr. Judy Mikovits, will result in article after article explaining how these people are spreading medical misinformation, that they are anti-vax conspiracy theorists, and that they need to be silenced. I encourage you to read those articles and decide for yourself. My perspective is that these search results, in fact, show the depth and coordination of the response between Big Pharma, Big Tech, Big Media, and supposedly independent fact-checkers like PolitiFact and Snopes. The implications here are profound and they are urgent. In part 3, I'll discuss some of the nefarious activities of both Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates in the decades leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. The evidence shows that this pandemic was not an isolated event. Rather, it was the culmination of decades of work corrupting the institutions of public health on behalf of Big Pharma. I'll then recommend that we as U.S. citizens come together to fund a professional private investigation into the acts of these men and their co-conspirators. My expectation is that such an investigation would demonstrate the violation of numerous federal statutes, which are predicate acts to the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, known as the RICO statute. In part 4, I'll add an 8th allegation of corruption. This cabal, through their control of the medical establishment and the scientific community, has suppressed the true nature of human physiology and cosmology. Here I'll highlight 3 tiers of this suppression. First, the suppression of miasma theory in favor of germ theory. Second, the suppression of holistic medicine in favor of allopathic or Western medicine. And 3, the suppression of a consciousness-based cosmology in favor of an atheistic, materialistic cosmology. Finally, in part 5, I'll end with some words for Maddie Garay and anyone else who has been injured, killed, censored, gaslit, locked in a psychiatric ward, or otherwise hurt by the COVID conspirators. We hear you. You are not alone. Truth triumphs in the long run. Part 2, Timeline of COVID-19 Corruption. Part 2 constitutes most of this essay, so I've broken it into sections A through U. I've done my best to keep it tight, but there are a lot of nuances to cover. Sections A through N covered the development of the pharmaceutical industrial complex. These sections will describe how the robber barons in control of Big Pharma are the same group that now controls big banking, big tech, big oil, big media, and most of the other largest multinational corporations. These conspirators leveraged their power to force corporate consolidation, regulatory capture, and a broken system of institutionalized sick care. I'll argue that the interests of pharma, the media, the government, regulatory bodies, and the intelligence agencies have become deeply corrupted and entangled over the past 100 plus years. In sections O through S, I'll demonstrate how the criminals in control of these organizations leveraged their power to pre-plan and coordinate the COVID-19 pandemic, which should be classified as a false flag attack. In section T, I'll walk through Maddie to Garay's story in detail and demonstrate how this perfectly healthy 12-year-old girl suffered several serious adverse events after receiving her second vaccine during the Pfizer trial for 12 to 15-year-olds. Maddie's reaction was then suppressed. She was continuously gaslit throughout the process and was almost thrown into a psych ward to keep her quiet. Both the final trial report, published by lead researcher Dr. Robert Frank, and the FDA emergency use authorization for the vaccine for children minimized and lied about her reaction, which alone should have been enough to prevent the FDA's approval for the drug. Unfortunately, Maddie's story is not unique, and there are similar instances of fraud and cover-up across the other COVID-19 vaccine trials. Following the global rollout of the vaccines despite their dangers, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of other vaccine-injured patients have been systematically suppressed, censored, and gaslit. Finally, in section U, I'll touch on Dr. Fauci's recent retirement announcement and segue into part 3, in which I argue that we must bring justice to Fauci, Gates, and the rest of the COVID cabal. Section A, early 1900s. John D. Rockefeller and the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Oligarchs discover pharmaceuticals. John D. Rockefeller, the notorious robber baron and big oil monopolist, was then the richest man in history. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the Standard Oil monopoly, and his net worth was over $500 billion in today's dollars. Rockefeller's ruthless tactics in building his empire earned him a reputation as the greatest criminal of the age, according to men like Senator Robert Lafayette. JDR saw an opportunity to expand his wealth by developing pharmaceutical uses for refinery byproducts. At that time, nearly half the physicians in medical colleges practiced holistic or herbal medicine, and synthetic medicines were a recent innovation. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, the big steel robber baron, decided to catalog America's 155 medical colleges. This culminated in 1910 with the Flexner Report to the Carnegie Foundation, which recommended centralizing America's medical schooling and abolishing miasma theory. Miasma theory emphasized preventing disease by fortifying the immune system through nutrition and by reducing exposures to environmental toxins and stresses. Miasma theory was to be replaced by germ theory, which held that germs alone caused disease. This narrative fundamentally shifted the pharmaceutical paradigm towards one that favored the development of synthetic medicines. I'll return to the implications of miasma versus germ theory in part 4. With this new narrative, Rockefeller financed the campaign to consolidate mainstream medicine, co-opt the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry, and shutter its competition. Rockefeller's crusade caused the closure of more than half of American medical schools, fostered public and press scorn for homeopathy, osteopathy, chiropractic, nutritional, holistic, functional, integrative, and natural medicines, and led to the incarceration of many practicing physicians. The year after the Flexner Report, the Supreme Court ruled Standard Oil as an unreasonable monopoly and forced it to break into 34 companies that today include Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and Marathon. Ironically, this trust-busting increased Rockefeller's personal wealth, of which he donated $100 million from the windfall to his General Education Board to streamline and homogenize medical schools and hospitals. In 1913, Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Foundation, RF. Philanthropic foundations were a new innovation of the era, and detractors criticized them as nothing more than tax evasion. A congressional investigation into the foundation described it as a self-serving artifice posing a menace to the future political and economic welfare of the nation. Despite these setbacks, Rockefeller eventually persuaded the public and Congress of his benevolent intentions, through his control of the press and by hiring teams of doctors and scientists to exaggerate the benefits of medications developed by the foundation. From there, the RF was off to the races. The Rockefeller Foundation provided large grants to scientists to identify active chemicals in disease-curing plants used by traditional doctors, and then synthesize and produce patent-protected petrochemical versions of the molecules. The Foundation's philosophy of a pill for an ill has shaped the American view of healthcare over the subsequent 100-plus years. As Rockefeller's advisor Frederick Taylor Gates had advised, judicious disposal of his fortune might also blunt further inquiry into its origins. This is exactly what happened, and through this bait and switch, John Dee was able to change his reputation in the history books from a robber baron to a philanthropist, at least temporarily. The Rockefeller Foundation goes global. Between 1913 and 1951, the RF expanded operations to more than 80 countries. The foundation became the de facto authority on managing global diseases, providing almost half the budget for the League of Nations Health Organization, the predecessor organization for the World Health Organization, WHO. The RF imbued the League with its philosophy, structure, values, precepts, and ideologies, all of which were inherited by the WHO. Critics allege that despite spending the equivalent of billions campaigning against tropical diseases in almost 100 countries and colonies, these campaigns were window dressing for the RF's true intentions. The true purpose of the Foundation's expansion was to open developing world markets for U.S. oil, mining, pharmaceutical, telecom, and banking multinational corporations in which the Foundation and Rockefeller family were also invested. John D. Rockefeller may have been the original gangster to sacrifice public health for personal profit, but unfortunately, he was not the last. We'll see that nearly a century later, Bill Gates replicated Rockefeller's strategy through his control of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, BMGF, and other NGOs like the WHO and UNITAID. Gates has spent decades leveraging Rockefeller's corrupt tactics for his financial benefit and increased stature in the global corporatocracy. Section B, 1943 to 1953, Intelligence Agencies and Bioweapons. In spring of 1943, the U.S. began its first large-scale research initiative into offensive bioweapons on orders from President Roosevelt during WW II. This Pentagon program was run by pharmaceutical titan George Merck while he simultaneously ran his massive pharmaceutical corporation. Merck boasted that his team could deliver biowarfare agents without vast expenditures or constructing huge facilities. Another advantage of bioweapons was their development could proceed under the guise of legitimate medical research. The intelligence agencies were involved in the program from the beginning. Merck's employee, Frank Olson, was an American bacteriologist, biological warfare scientist, and CIA agent. Olson worked for the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, USBWL, at Fort Detrick, with Merck and the U.S. military, developing the U.S. bioweapons and psi-warfare arsenal. Olson was also involved in Project Artichoke, an experimental CIA interrogation program using psychedelics like LSD in search of enhanced interrogation methods. Artichoke was part of a larger CIA program exploring approaches for controlling both individuals and populations. In May of 1952, Olson began to have moral misgivings about his work in Project Artichoke, and a few months later informed his bosses he intended to quit the biowarfare program. Around that time, his CIA colleague, Sidney Gottlieb, head of CIA's MKUltra program, covertly dosed him with LSD. A week later, on November 28, 1953, Olson fell to his death from a window at New York's Hotel Statler. The U.S. government first described his death as a suicide, then as a misadventure. In 1975, the U.S. government admitted its guilt in the murder, giving the Olson family an out-of-court settlement and official apologies from President Gerald Ford and then CIA Director William Colby. The intelligence agency's work in psychological warfare, domestic and foreign, assassination, and biological weapons development is widely suspected to remain ongoing and significant. Section C, 1967 to 1976, CIA and Media Entanglement. In March 1967, Ramparts magazine broke a story indicating the CIA and NSA's secret funding of education groups such as the National Student Association. Over the next decade, several investigations would probe the CIA's ties with the news media, including Carl Bernstein's Rolling Stone cover story published in 1977 titled The CIA and the Media. Bernstein, who had broken the Watergate scandal a few years earlier, reported in this article that 400 American journalists had carried out assignments for CIA over the past 25 years. The CIA's involvement with the press began during the earliest days of the Cold War, when Allen Dulles, who became CIA director in 1953, sought to establish a recruiting and cover capability within America's most prestigious journalistic institutions. During a 1976 investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Church Committee, the depths of the CIA's involvement with the press became apparent to several members of the panel. But top officials of the CIA, including former directors William Colby and George H.W. Bush, persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry into the matter and to deliberately misinterpret the actual scope of the activities in its final report. The CIA's infiltration of the media is known as Project Mockingbird. In the early 1970s, 42 CIA and NSA people were employed at a national news agency. Mockingbird has never been officially discontinued, and the intelligence agency's relationship with the press is widely suspected to remain ongoing and deep. This illegal, clear conflict of interest goes unchecked and allows the men and women running the intelligence suppression agencies to distort major news stories in their desired direction. So for one hypothetical example, let's imagine intelligence agents were involved in criminal, gain-of-function research on a coronavirus. If said coronavirus were to be leaked from its laboratory, causing a global pandemic, these same intelligence agents could leverage their conduits in the media to distort the narrative. These media assets could then convince the public the outbreak had started from something innocuous, like a man eating a bat in a seafood market. These same media assets could then vilify and censor anyone who went against the official narrative and claimed the outbreak had started from illegal bioweapons research. And anyone who questioned the official narrative and pointed to evidence that intelligence agents had intentionally released the virus as an act of bioterrorism on behalf of their big pharma corporate overlords, those people could be dismissively labeled as conspiracy theorist anti-vaxxers and censored by every platform controlled by their oligopoly. Section D, 1969 to 1972. The end of bioweapons, or so we were told. By 1969, the U.S. bioweapons program had developed weapons of a nuclear equivalence, according to David Franz, who served 23 years as the commander of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease, U.S. AMRID. Franz noted that the principal limitation of bioweapons was the difficulty in managing bioweapons so as to prevent accidental escape. Ironically, Franz would later play a key role during the Pentagon Fauci gain-of-function programs leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gain-of-function refers to an organism acquiring a new ability or function through either natural selection or a researcher's experiments. America's bioweapons program allegedly came to an end in 1969 when President Nixon traveled to Fort Detrick to announce its closure for moral and strategic reasons. The U.S. signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, which forbade development, use, and stockpiling of biological weapons and mothballed most of its labs. But the agreement left thousands of scientists, military contractors, and Pentagon staff as stranded assets pushing for the program's revival. The treaty also included a major loophole. It allowed production of anthrax and other biological warfare agents for vaccine production. Section E, December 12, 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act was signed into law by President Jimmy Carter. This major piece of deregulation amended patent law so that organizations and government employees could now retain economic interests in patented medicines that had been funded by the American taxpayer. This law changed the game for academic institutions and health agencies, as they were now highly incentivized to produce more patents and benefit financially. It seems to me that this could create conflicts of interest. Here's Doctors Mark Leary and Judy Mikovits describing the impact of Bayh-Dole.
Bayh-Dole fundamentally changed the way universities approach technology transfer, and you can see that best in the statistics. Universities obtain 16 times as many patents today as they did in 1980. Now, everybody's getting more patents, but still, universities' share of all patents in the United States is more than 5 times greater than it was before Bayh-Dole. The situation has gotten so bad that one information technology industry official has publicly referred to universities as, quote, crack addicts, unquote, driven by, quote, small-minded tech transfer offices addicted to patent royalties.
That act gave government workers the right to patent their discoveries. So to claim intellectual property for discoveries that the taxpayer paid for. Ever since that happened in the early 80s, it destroyed science. And this allowed the development of those conflicts of interest. And this is the crime behind letting somebody like Bill Gates with billions of dollars, nobody elected him, he has no medical background, he has no expertise, but we let people like that have a voice in this country while we destroy the lives of millions of people.
Section F, November 1984. Fauci's reign at NIAID begins. Dr. Anthony Fauci took over as head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, after working his way up through the agency for 16 years. Dr. Fauci will have served as NIAID's director for the past 38 years through his planned retirement in December. He is now the highest paid of all 4 million federal employees, including the president, receiving an annual salary of $417,608. Per RFK Jr., during Fauci's now 50 years with the NIAID, Dr. Fauci has wielded formidable power to fortify the pharmaceutical industry's explosive growth and its corrosive influence over our government regulatory agencies and public health policy. He has nurtured a complex web of financial entanglements among pharmaceutical companies and NIAID and its employees that has transformed NIAID into a seamless subsidiary of the pharmaceutical industry. From his perch at NIAID, Dr. Fauci has used his $6 billion annual budget to achieve dominance and control over a long list of agencies and governing bodies, including the CDC, FDA, Health and Human Services agencies, the National Institutes of Health, the Pentagon, the White House, the World Health Organization, the United Nations organizations, and into the deep pockets of the Clinton and Gates Foundations and Britain's The Wellcome Trust. Since 2005, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, has funneled an additional $1.7 billion into Dr. Fauci's annual discretionary budget to launder sketchy funding for biological weapons research, often of dubious legality. The Pentagon funding brings the annual total of grants that Dr. Fauci dispenses to an astonishing $7.7 billion, almost twice the annual donations of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Working in close collaboration with pharmaceutical companies and other large grant makers, including Bill Gates, the biggest funder of vaccines in the world, Dr. Fauci has consistently used his awesome power to defund, bully, silence, delicense, and ruin scientists whose research threatens the pharmaceutical paradigm, and to reward those scientists who support him. When so-called independent expert HHS panels license and recommend new pharmaceuticals, Dr. Fauci's control over those panels gives him the power to fast-track his pet drugs and vaccines through the regulatory hurdles, often skipping key milestones like animal testing or functional human safety studies. Dr. Fauci's funding strategies evince a bias for developing and promoting patented medicines and vaccines, and for sabotaging and discrediting off-patent therapeutic drugs, nutrition, vitamins, and natural, functional, and integrative medicines. Under his watch, drug companies engineered the opioid crisis and made American citizens the globe's most over-medicated population. During his half-century as America's health czar, Dr. Fauci has played a central role in crafting a world where Americans pay the highest price for medicine and suffer the worst health outcomes compared to other wealthy nations. Adverse drug reactions are among the nation's top 3 leading causes of death after cancer and heart attacks. Dr. Fauci's impressive longevity at NIAID is largely due to his enthusiasm for promoting the pharmacentric agenda. Here's Dr. Mike Yaden, the former vice chairman of Pfizer, explaining the conflict of interest between research funding and the medical establishment.
People need to understand that academics have been threatened with losing their position and threatened with getting no further research grants if they speak out against the narrative. Guess why that is? 2/3 of the world's non-commercial biological research is funded by just 3 bodies. The Wellcome Trust in the UK, the NIH, and specifically the NIAID under Tony Fauci, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Section G, November 14th, 1986. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. The NVCIA was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. This major piece of deregulation granted total immunity to vaccine manufacturers who'd previously been going bankrupt due to a decade of lawsuits over vaccine injuries and deaths. These vaccine manufacturers had joined together as a cartel and threatened to stop making vaccines until they could be legally shielded from liability. The NVCIA established a federal program for compensated vaccine-related injuries and deaths, moving the financial responsibility away from vaccine producers and onto the American taxpayer. The NCVIA also established the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, to track adverse events from vaccines. Unfortunately, Big Pharma, through regulatory capture, has corrupted this reporting system. Vaccine-injured individuals and their advocates have alleged widespread suppression of adverse events since VAERS was implemented. Vaccine-injured patients now have an almost impossible time finding a doctor who will acknowledge that their injuries resulted from vaccines, let alone receiving compensation to pay for their injuries. I'll highlight the depths of this criminality as it relates to COVID-19 vaccines and Maddie to Garay's story specifically in Section T. On Substack, I've included the CDC's recommended vaccine schedule in 1983, 3 years before the NCVIA was passed. At that time, children were recommended 11 vaccines between 2 months and 16 years of age. By 2021, that number has ballooned to 53 vaccines by the time one turns 18, inclusive of annual influenza shots. The question must be asked, do all these vaccines clearly heal more than they harm? Is it simply a coincidence that we saw a dramatic increase in the recommended number of vaccines in the decades after pharmaceutical companies were relieved of all legal liability in manufacturing them? Section H, February 8, 1996. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 and consolidation of big media. The Telecom Act of 1996 was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. This major piece of deregulation allowed for the convergence of broadcasting and the telecommunications market. Fairness and accuracy in reporting, FAIR, described the law as essentially bought and paid for by corporate media lobbies and radically opened the floodgates on mergers. The act dramatically reduced important Federal Communications Commission FCC regulations on cross-ownership and allowed giant corporations to buy up thousands of media outlets across the country, increasing their monopoly on the flow of information in the United States and around the world. 26 years after its passage, 6 major corporations now control 90% of U.S. media: Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers, Discovery, Fox Corporation, Sony, and Paramount Global. These dynamics are the exact same ones we've seen with the consolidation of health insurance companies, pharmaceutical benefits managers, and pharmacies into giant conglomerates like United Health Group, Elevance Health, formerly known as Anthem, Cigna, Humana, and CVS Health. This health insurance oligopoly is then able to collude with the big pharma cartel and ensure our nation remains locked in a broken system of institutionalized sick care. Here I want to emphasize the importance of oligopoly, corporate consolidation, and deregulation on the cabal's ability to influence the world. When you allow massive multinational companies unfettered ability to consolidate, both through vertical and horizontal integration, you restrict power and control to fewer and fewer hands. So nefarious actors only need to control a few massive corporations through a handful of highly placed operatives within those organizations. Pulling back the curtain on robber barons throughout the ages, like Rockefeller and the big oil oligopoly, Merck and the big pharma oligopoly, and Gates and the big tech oligopoly, you start to recognize the dangerous levels to which they've been able to consolidate power and wealth. This is how the cabal has corrupted all their controlled organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Federal Reserve, the World Economic Forum, and the Special Access Program Central Office within the Department of Defense. These bad actors can then use their exorbitant wealth to capture politicians and regulators and to ensure the rules are increasingly stacked in their favor. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. In 1934, President FDR wrote, "If this process of the concentration of wealth and power goes on at its present rate, by the end of this century, we shall have all of America's industry and finance controlled by less than 12 corporations that are owned and run by less than 100 men. Putting it plainly, we are on and are still steering a steady course towards economic and political oligarchy." This is exactly what has happened. By 2014, the richest 85 people in the world had more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion people. Something is deeply broken. That means the top 0.0000001% have more wealth than the bottom 50%. How could this possibly happen by accident? The answer? It hasn't. This consolidation of wealth and power has been orchestrated by those in control of this cabal for over a century, and they have executed flawlessly. Section I, May 1998, the Microsoft monopoly. Gates goes from robber baron to philanthropist, or so we thought. The Department of Justice sued Microsoft, founded by Bill Gates, for antitrust violations. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ruled that Microsoft had violated the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, outlawing monopolies and cartels, saying, "Microsoft placed an oppressive thumb on the scale of competitive fortune, thereby effectively guaranteeing its continued dominance in the relevant markets." This was the same act that led the Supreme Court 87 years earlier to force the breakup of Rockefeller's Standard Oil. An appeals court later overturned Judge Jackson's ruling to divide Microsoft in half. Instead, Microsoft just had to pay an $800,000 fine and to share computing interfaces with competing firms. However, significant reputational damage had been done to Gates throughout the trial. Judge Jackson complained that Gates' testimony was evasive and forgetful, and observed that he has a Napoleonic concept of himself and his company, an arrogance that derives from power and unalloyed success, with no leavening heart experiences, no reverses. The history of Microsoft's founding has been distorted to present Bill Gates as an entrepreneurial, tenacious tech nerd who founded the company in his parents' garage. In reality, Gates came from a wealthy family, and his great-grandfather had made a fortune in banking, leaving Bill a trust fund worth millions in today's dollars. His mother was on the United Way board in 1980 alongside then IBM chairman John Opel, and she was able to convince Opel to take a chance on her son, propelling Gates and Microsoft into the big leagues. Here's Gates' co-founder Paul Allen describing on 60 Minutes how Gates and Microsoft executive Steve Ballmer had conspired to oust him from the company and steal his shares while he was recovering from cancer in the early 1980s.
They were basically talking about how they were planning to dilute my share down to almost nothing. And it was really a shocking and disheartening moment for me.
And you were sick?
Well, I think I was still probably in the middle of radiation therapy.
Also in 2000, Microsoft settled a $97 million class action lawsuit over their treatment of workers they classified as temporary and to whom they refused to pay benefits. 2 years later, European regulators levied a $1.36 billion fine against Microsoft, the highest penalty in EU history. Gates' response to the snowballing popular disgust was lobbying Congress to slash the Justice Department's budget and by hiring an army of PR firms to soften his image as a ruthless and duplicitous king baby robber baron. Was it now time for Gates to consider the advice that had been given to Rockefeller after similar reputational damage, namely that judicious disposal of his fortune might also blunt further inquiry into its origins? So in 2000, the Gates Foundation, or BMGF, announced a 9-year, $500 million plan to fund AIDS vaccine development through Gates's International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI, the predecessor organization to the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi. Gates's foundation, founded in 1994, expanded Gates's wealth and power by leveraging the operational philosophy of philanthrocapitalism. Here's RFK Jr.'s description of the history and tactics of the BMGF. Bill and Melinda Gates donated $36 billion of Microsoft stock between 1994 and 2020. Very early on, Gates created a separate entity, Bill Gates Investments, BGI, which manages his personal wealth and his foundation's corpus. Renamed BMGI in January 2015 to include Melinda, the company predominantly invests that loot in multinational food, agriculture, pharmaceutical, energy, telecom, and tech companies with global operations. Federal tax law requires the BMGF to give away 7% of its foundation assets annually to qualify for tax exemptions. Gates strategically targets BMGF's charitable gifts to give him control of the international health and agricultural agencies and the media, allowing him to dictate global health and food policies so as to increase profitability of the large multinationals in which he and his foundation hold large investment positions. Following such tactics, the Gates Foundation has given away some $54.8 billion since 1994, but instead of depleting his wealth, those gifts have magnified it. Strategic philanthropizing increased the Gates Foundation's capital corpus to $49.8 billion by 2019. Moreover, Gates's personal net worth grew from $63 billion in 2000 to $133.6 billion today. Gates's wealth expanded by $23 billion just during the 2020 lockdowns that he and Dr. Fauci played key roles in orchestrating. In 2017, the Huffington Post observed that the Gates Foundation blurs the boundaries between philanthropy, business, and nonprofits, and cautioned that calling Gates's investment strategy philanthropy was causing the rapid deconstruction of the accepted term. Gates's pharmaceutical investments are particularly relevant, since shortly after its founding, his foundation has owned stakes in multiple drug companies. A recent investigation by The National revealed that the Gates Foundation currently holds corporate stocks and bonds in drug companies like Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Novartis, and Sanofi. Gates also has heavy positions in Gilead, Biogen, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Novavax, and Inovio. The Foundation's website candidly declares its mission to seek more effective models of collaboration with major vaccine manufacturers to better identify and pursue mutually beneficial opportunities. Gates and Fauci, the perfect partners in crime. In 2002, Gates brought Dr. Fauci to Seattle, where the two met for the first time to discuss a partnership that has lasted ever since, profoundly impacting humanity. Fauci remembered,
he had a bunch of international global health leaders that he invited to his home. Melinda was showing everyone in the tour of the house, and he said, "Can I have some time with you in my library, in this amazingly beautiful library?" So we went into his library and we sat down, and it was there that he said, "Tony, you run the biggest infectious disease institute in the world, and I want to make sure the money I spend is well spent. Why don't we really get to know each other? Why don't we be partners?" Our interactions and our collaborations became closer and closer.
Over the next 20 years, the Gates-Fauci partnership would expand to include pharmaceutical companies, military and intelligence planners, and international health agencies, all collaborating to promote weaponized pandemics and vaccines in a new brand of corporate imperialism rooted in the ideology of biosecurity. That project would yield Mr. Gates and Dr. Fauci unprecedented bonanzas in wealth and power and have catastrophic consequences for democracy and humanity. Section J, 1999 to 2001. Robert Kadlec and the biodefense industry. With the Gates-Fauci partnership solidified, these two men now controlled most of the funding for global medical research. Of course, controlling legal research was not enough for them. Morality, legality, and ethics had never been considerations for Gates or Fauci, and bioweapons were the natural next target for their empire. Enter Colonel Dr. Robert Kadlec and the intelligence agencies. Per RFK Jr., Kadlec is an American physician and retired colonel in the U.S. Air Force with deep ties to spy agencies, Big Pharma, the Pentagon, and military contractors who profiteer from the spread of bioweapons alarmism. Second only to his longtime crony and comrade in arms Anthony Fauci, Robert Kadlec played an historic leadership role in fomenting the contagious logic that infectious disease posed a national security threat requiring a militarized response. In 1998, Kadlec created an internal strategy paper for the Pentagon, promoting the development of pandemic pathogens as a stealth weapon that the Pentagon could deploy against its enemies without leaving fingerprints. In this paper, he wrote, "Biological weapons under the cover of an endemic or natural disease occurrence provides an attacker the potential for plausible denial. Biological warfare's potential to create significant economic losses and consequent political instability, coupled with plausible deniability, exceeds the possibilities of any other human weapons." Kadlec's ideas helped him win an appointment as Special Assistant for Biodefense Planning to President George W. Bush after the post-September 11th anthrax attacks later that same year. From this sinecure, Kadlec's fervent lobbying persuaded Congress to establish a strategic national stockpile whose contents are currently worth $7 billion. Kadlec would come to control purchases for that stockpile, and following the lead of his comrades, Bill Gates and Tony Fauci, he would use that power to enrich his vaccine industry friends and sideline public health. As journalist Alexis Baden-Mayer observed, Kadlec created the biodefense industrial complex as we know it, and he rules it like a czar. In 1999, Dr. Kadlec organized a simulation of a smallpox terrorist attack on U.S. soil for a joint exercise by the newly formed Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies and the Department of Health and Human Services, currently directed by Tom Inglesby. That year, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation committed $20 million to Johns Hopkins to establish the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health. For the next 2 decades, Gates would direct a vast stream of funding to the enterprise of elevating biosecurity as the national priority. Some of his most visible investments funded a series of simulations provided over by Inglesby at his Johns Hopkins Center. Those simulations would make Inglesby the congenial face of biosecurity paranoia, feed the burgeoning biodefense industry, and help lay the foundation for the modern security state. The deal pipeline from NIH and NIAID to Johns Hopkins, an astonishing $13 billion since 2001, dwarfs Gates' contributions to the school. But shoddy or perhaps deliberately obscure reporting makes it nearly impossible to determine how many of these dollars flowed to Inglesby and his center. Kadlec's simulations, and over a dozen that would succeed over the next 20 years plus, many under Bill Gates' direction, shared common features. None of them emphasized protecting public health by showing Americans how to bolster their immune systems, to eat well, to lose weight, to exercise, to maintain vitamin D levels, and to avoid chemical exposure. None of these focused on devising the vital communication infrastructures to link frontline doctors during a pandemic or to facilitate the development and refinement of optical treatment protocols. None of these dealt seriously with the need to identify off-the-shelf, now known as repurposed, therapeutic drugs to mitigate fatalities and to shorten a pandemic's duration. None of them considered ways to isolate the sick and protect the vulnerable, or how to shield people in nursing homes and other institutions from infections. None of them questioned the efficacy of masks, lockdowns, and social distancing in reducing casualties. None of them engaged in soul searching about how to preserve constitutional rights during a global pandemic. Instead, the simulations wargamed how to use police powers to detain and quarantine citizens, how to impose martial law, how to control messaging by deploying propaganda, how to employ censorship to silence dissent, and how to mandate masks, lockdowns, and coercive vaccinations and conduct track and trace surveillance among potentially reluctant populations. Coercion should be the last strategy to consider in a pandemic, remarked physician and biological warfare expert Meryl Nass, MD. If you have a remedy that works, people will flock to it. It's troubling that the first and only option was creating a police state. And then what do you know? After over 20 years of bioweapons fear-mongering, Kadlec had perfectly positioned himself as President Trump's Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services for Preparedness and Response, or ASPR, with his appointment approved by Congress in 2017. When the COVID-19 pandemic was declared in early 2020, he was the man in control of the strategic national stockpile he'd been instrumental in creating. What fortuitous luck on Kadlec's part. Section K, 1999 to 2007. The development of coronavirus patents. In 1999 through the early 2000s, patents for the coronavirus started showing up. The researchers and organizations tied to those patents include the Center for Disease Control and Dr. Ralph Baric, who we'll discuss further shortly. Dr. David Martin is an inventor and intellectual property expert. Here's Dr. Martin describing the platform he created to monitor digitized patents, the history of coronavirus patents, and their implications.
I'm the developer of linguistic genomics, which was the first platform on which you could determine the intent of communication rather than the literal artifact of communication. But we've also used that technology for a number of other applications in defense and intelligence and finance, and most notably in the early 2000s, my company was responsible for bringing down what was at the time one of the largest tax frauds in U.S. history. We maintained a series of inquiries into every individual, every organization, and every company that is involved in anything that either blurs the line of biological and chemical weapons or crosses that line in any of 168 countries. In 1999, there were 1 million patents digitized by IBM, and those 1 million patents were the first time human innovation had been put into an electronic digital searchable format. We took that information and we did a very simple exercise using our linguistic genomics technology, where I made the horrific assessment that approximately 1/3 of all patents filed in the United States were functional forgeries, meaning that while they had linguistic variations, they actually covered the same subject matter. In 1999, patents on coronavirus started showing up, and thus began the rabbit trail.
March 2003. Panic grips Hong Kong as a deadly new virus sweeps through the city.
In 2003, the Center for Disease Control saw the possibility of a gold strike, and that was the coronavirus outbreak that happened in Asia. They saw that a virus they knew could be easily manipulated was something that was very valuable, and in 2003, they sought to patent it. And they made sure that they controlled the proprietary rights to the disease, to the virus, and to its detection, and all of the measurement of it. We know that Anthony Fauci, that Ralph Baric, that the Center for Disease Control, and the laundry list of people who wanted to take credit for inventing coronavirus were at the hub of this story. From 2003 to 2018, they controlled 100% of the cash flow that built the empire around the industrial complex of coronavirus.
The World Health Organization has officially named the novel coronavirus
the novel coronavirus outbreak.
The World Health Organization has declared
an international public health emergency.
While we know that the coronavirus manipulation started with Dr. Ralph Baric in 1999.
The major characteristics of SARS, MERS, and SARS coronavirus 2. It's a good way for you.
Ralph Baric is the researcher at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who is famous for his chimeric coronavirus research. In 2002, there was a recognition that the coronavirus was seen as an exploitable mechanism for both good and ill. On April the 25th, 2003, the U.S. Center for Disease Control filed a patent on the coronavirus transmitted to humans. Under 35 U.S. Code Section 101, nature is prohibited from being patented. Either SARS coronavirus was manufactured, therefore making a patent on it legal, or it was natural, therefore making a patent on it illegal. If it was manufactured, it was a violation of biological and chemical weapons, treaties, and laws. If it was natural, filing a patent on it was illegal. In either outcome, both are illegal. In the spring of 2007, the CDC filed a petition with the Patent Office to keep their application confidential and private. They actually filed patents on not only the virus, but they also filed patents on its detection and a kit to measure it. Because of that CDC patent, they had the ability to control who was authorized and who was not authorized to make independent inquiries into coronavirus. You cannot look at the virus, you cannot measure it, you cannot develop a test kit for it. And by ultimately receiving the patents that constrained anyone from using it, they had the means, they had the motive, and most of all, they had the monetary gain from turning coronavirus from a pathogen to profit.
On Substack, I've included links to several of the relevant patents. US 7279327B2, Methods for Producing Recombinant Coronavirus, filed by Ralph Barrick, Christopher Curtis, and Boyant of UNC Chapel Hill in April 2002, granted in October 2007. US 7220852, Coronavirus Isolated from Humans, filed by a team of researchers at the CDC and HHS in April and May 2004, granted in May 2007. US 7776521B1, Coronavirus Isolated from Humans, filed by many of the same CDC and HHS team in May 2007, granted in August 2010. Section L, December 30th, 2005, the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act was signed into law by President George W. Bush. This major piece of deregulation granted legal protection to companies making or distributing critical medical supplies, such as vaccines and treatments, unless there's willful misconduct by the company. As part of the PrEP Act, Congress created a fund, CICP, specifically to help cover lost wages and out-of-pocket medical expenses for people who have been irreparably harmed by a covered countermeasure, such as a vaccine. But it is difficult to use and rarely pays. Attorneys say it has compensated less than 6% of the claims filed in the last decade. On March 10, 2020, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, issued a PrEP Act declaration to provide liability immunity to corporations against any COVID-19 covered countermeasures. This was defined as any antiviral, any other drug, any biologic, any diagnostic, any other device, or any vaccine used to treat, diagnose, cure, prevent, or mitigate COVID-19 or the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 or a virus mutating therefrom, or any device used in the administration of such product and all components and constituent materials of any such product. As we saw with the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, regulators had no misgivings in granting total immunization of liability to pharmaceutical companies at the expense of the taxpayer and potential danger to patients taking these covered countermeasures. Section M, February 20th, 2010. Gates and population control. Less than 1 month before committing $10 billion to the WHO, Bill Gates gave his TED Talk called Innovating to Zero. In his talk, he made a now infamous statement about how reducing world population growth could be done in part with new vaccines.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
We'll return to the implications of this statement and how defenders of Gates have misrepresented the fallout from the TED Talk to dismiss everyone who highlights Gates' corruption as crazy conspiracy theorists. Section N, 2012 to 2015, offshoring to China. During this time period, something happened internally at the NIH. Someone within the organization or above it started to question the ethics and legality of the research being done at NIH. Here's David Miller again explaining what happened next.
Somewhere between 2012 and 2013, something happened. The federal funding for research that was feeding into places like Harvard, Emory, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that funding suddenly became impaired by something that happened at the NIH, where the NIH got this little tiny moment of clarity and said, I think something we're doing is wrong. And in 2013, the NIH said gain-of-function research on coronavirus should be suspended. The National Institutes of Health had a moral and social and potentially legal reason to object to research. But the letters that were sent to the researchers essentially said, you are receiving notice that we're telling you to stop. And now on the bottom of the page, we're going to clarify what stop means. Keep going. But when the heat gets hot in 2014 and 15, what do? You offshore the research. You fund the Wuhan Institute of Virology to do the stuff that sounds like it's getting a little edgy with respect to its morality and legality. But do you do it straight way? No. You run the money through a series of cover organizations to make it look like you're funding a U.S. operation, which then subcontracts with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The U.S. could say, China did it. China could say, the U.S. did it. And the cool thing is, both of them are almost telling the truth.
Section O, October 18th, 2019, Event 201. Event 201 was held in New York 5 months before the COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the WHO and 3 weeks after U.S. intelligence agencies believed the first case of COVID-19 occurred. The pandemic preparedness exercise, funded by the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, simulated the global response to a coronavirus pandemic. Like the virus war game Crimson Contagion 2019 2 months earlier, Event 201 was a training and signaling exercise for government biosecurity functionaries. Here's RFK Jr.'s explanation of the event. This war game consisted of 4 tabletop simulations of a worldwide coronavirus pandemic. Participants included a group of high-ranking kahunas from the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, Bloomberg, Johns Hopkins University Population Center, the CDC, various media powerhouses, the Chinese government, a former CIA NSA director, vaccine maker Johnson & Johnson, the globe's largest pharmaceutical company, finance and biosecurity industry chieftains, and the president of Edelman, the world's leading corporate PR firm. Conspiracy-minded critics dubbed this cabal the Deep State. The World Economic Forum director Klaus Schwab has christened their agenda the Great Reset. Event 201 was a signaling exercise, but it was also a training run for a government in waiting. Its principals would quickly move into key positions to run pandemic response a few months later. At Gates' direction, the participants role-played members of a pandemic control council, wargaming a contagion that serves as a pretext for this insurgency against American democracy. They drilled a retinue of psychological warfare techniques for controlling official narratives, silencing dissent, forcibly masking large populations, and leveraging the pandemic to promote mandatory mass vaccinations. Needless to say, there was little talk of building or fortifying immune systems, existing off-the-shelf remedies, or off-patent therapeutic drugs and vitamins. Instead, there was abundant palaver about expanding government's authoritarian powers, imposing draconian restrictions, curtailing traditional civil rights, which might include rights of assembly, free speech, private property, jury trials, due process, and religious worship, as well as promoting and coercing the uptake of new, patentable antiviral drugs and vaccines. The participants walked through imaginary global coronavirus contagion scenarios that focused on fear-mongering, blanket censorship, mass propaganda, and police state strategies culminating in compulsory mass vaccinations. As with the Clade X simulation, the most trusted pharma-friendly media attended. Forbes and Bloomberg participated in the exercise, which focused on wargaming the medical cartel's censorship initiative. The Bloomberg Foundation is a major funder of the Johns Hopkins Center. Oddly, Gates later claimed that this simulation didn't occur. On April 12, 2020, Gates told BBC, "Now here we are. We didn't simulate this. We didn't practice, so both the health policies and economic policies, we find ourselves in uncharted territory." Unfortunately for that whopper, the videos of the event are still available across the internet. They show that Gates and team did indeed simulate health and economic policies. It's hard to swallow that Gates had forgotten. Here are some of the actual recordings of the event. Quite amazing how accurately they were able to predict how things would play out when a pandemic was declared less than 5 months later.
On behalf of our center and our partners, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our audience here in New York, as well as our larger virtual audience participating online today. The Event 201 scenario is fictional. Today's scenario is going to simulate meetings of a multi-stakeholder group called the Pandemic Emergency Board.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
There's been some conspiracy theories that are around about the potential that pharmaceutical companies or the UN have released this for their own benefit.
And maybe this is a time for us to showcase some cases where we are able to bring forward some bad actors and leave it before the courts to decide whether they have actually spread some fake news.
A new coronavirus. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia.
In related news, a significant demand for personal protective equipment like N95 masks and gloves are on the rise. Patients are overwhelming healthcare facilities. People are avoiding public spaces out of fear of infection and in compliance with public health recommendations. Our U.S. affiliate has just released polling results on public expectations for a vaccine, and 65% of those polled are eager to take the vaccine, even if it's experimental.
I am not optimistic about having the vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic.
With enough money and political will, anything is possible.
Penalties have been put in place for spreading harmful falsehoods, including arrests.
If the solution means controlling and reducing access to information, I think it's the right choice.
The world saw large-scale protests and in some places riots. This led to violent crackdowns in some countries and even martial law. The public lost trust in their respective administration. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad?
Of particular interest was the fourth simulation and its fixation on how to silence rumors that the coronavirus was laboratory generated. Here's RFK Jr. again. Event 201's fourth simulation anticipated the manipulation and control of public opinion and muzzling any colloquy about artificially enhanced pathogens. Everyone voiced their urgent concerns that authorities must instantly squelch and discredit any speculation that someone deliberately or accidentally released a lab-made bug. This segment is most revealing for its uncannily accurate prediction of democracy's current crisis. The fundamental assumption of all participants was that censorship and propaganda are legitimate exercises of federal power. The participants discussed mechanisms for stamping out disinformation and misinformation by flooding the media with propaganda or good information, imposing penalties for spreading falsehoods, and discrediting dissent, the anti-vaccination movement. Quite incredibly prescient for the actual scenario that played out over the ensuing months. Section P, October 2019 to March 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. The first case of contracted COVID-19 coronavirus is believed to have occurred sometime in October in Wuhan, China, although the first officially reported case remains December 2019. Concern over the pandemic spread quickly as cases grew, with the first reported case outside of China and Japan on January 3rd and the first reported U.S. case on January 16th. By March 10th, 2020, the WHO had declared the virus a global pandemic. On January 31st, Tony Fauci received an email from his grantee, virologist Christian Andersen, that he and other leading biologists believe that the genetic sequence responsible for the furencleave on the virus's spike protein, the peculiar structure that allows the organism to bind tightly to and infect cells with the ACE2 receptor, was highly unlikely to be the product of natural selection. 4 hours later, Dr. Anthony Fauci fired a carefully worded email to Cadillac. Dr. Fauci's other emails from that evening suggest that he was intensely worried that the Chinese experiments that may have created this striation in the novel coronavirus would bear his fingerprints. If Dr. Fauci's gain-of-function research had indeed minted COVID-19, then Cadillac would also be implicated. Cadillac served on the small so-called P3CO committee charged with approving NIH's gain-of-function experiments, and it's clear from Dr. Fauci's email that the subject was also on Cadillac's mind. Dr. Fauci attached an article to his email to Kadlec. It was Bat Lady Xi Jinping's deceitful effort to downplay the laboratory leak hypothesis. Bob, this just came out today, Dr. Fauci told his gain-of-function confederate. Gives a balanced view. Subsequent events proved that the author of that article was deliberately lying to conceal the Wuhan lab's manipulation of coronavirus pathogens that were nearly identical to the microbe that caused COVID-19. Both Kadlec and Fauci had been involved for over a decade in promoting and funding these dangerous experiments through NIAID and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA. BARDA is the biosecurity funding agency that Kadlec had helped create, including funneling millions of dollars in U.S. funding to Xi, the hapless writer of the exculpatory article. Dr. Fauci's email shows these two technocrats and others patching together evidence for the dubious official story they would tell the world. Here's immunologist and whistleblower Dr. Judy Mikovits when asked if COVID was created in the lab.
I wouldn't use the word created, but you can't say naturally occurring if it was by way of the laboratory. So it's very clear this virus was manipulated. This family of viruses was manipulated and studied in a laboratory where the animals were taken into the laboratory. And this is what was released, whether deliberate or not. That cannot be naturally occurring. Somebody didn't go to a market, get a bat. The virus didn't jump directly to humans. That's not how it works. That's accelerated viral evolution. If it was a natural occurrence, it would take it up to 800 years to occur. This occurred from SARS-1 within a decade. That's not naturally occurring.
And do you have any ideas of where this occurred?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it occurred between the North Carolina laboratories, Fort Detrick, U.S. Army Research Institute of Infectious Disease, and the Wuhan laboratory.
As most of us likely remember, talk of a lab leak in the early days of the pandemic was completely shut down, and the official narrative placed blame on the Wuhan seafood market. A few months earlier, the oracles of Event 201 had miraculously precognized this scenario of a lab leak conspiracy theory. For the remaining skeptics who didn't accept the bat soup theory, the big media and big tech oligopolies were ready to step in and censor those viewpoints. Throughout the real COVID pandemic, the cabal factions responsible for control of information were ready and willing to play their part in this organized corruption by suppressing discourse on the virus's origins, among other topics. Section Q, March 2020 to present, suppressing early treatment protocols. Fauci breaks pandemic protocol. Critics highlight that Fauci's pandemic response focused on mandatory lockdowns and waiting for vaccines. He spent no time educating the American public about bolstering their immune systems, did not instruct Americans to avoid harmful toxins like tobacco and alcohol, and never advised Americans to increase their zinc uptake, which had repeatedly shown success as a remedy for past coronaviruses, also known as the common cold. Instead, Fauci's response served to maximize stress and trauma, enforced isolation, mandated masking, business closures, evictions and bankruptcies, lockdowns, and separating children from parents. Stress, fear, and trauma, of course, wreak havoc on our immune system. Critics further argue that the slow the spread, flatten the curve, wait for the jab strategy, all in support of a long-term bet on unproven vaccines, represented a profound departure from accepted public health practice. But most troubling were Dr. Fauci's policies of ignoring and outright suppressing the early treatment of infected patients. In the next few sections, I'll be quoting from and playing audio from many of the pandemic heroes. This includes doctors and scientists who've challenged the Fauci-Gates response at great personal sacrifice to whistleblow the COVID cabal's corruption and to treat sick patients. This includes Drs. Harvey Risch, Peter McCullough, Tess Lawrie, Robert Malone, Pierre Corey, Ralph Merrick, Zev Zelenko, David Brownstein, and Meryl Nass, just to name a few. Of course, if you ask Google, fact-checkers like Snopes and PolitiFact, and the 90% of media platform controlled by 6 corporations, they will disagree with my categorization of these men and women as heroes. Rather, they will tell you how these people are anti-vaxxers and spreaders of medical misinformation who have been systematically deplatformed and censored. This attempt to suppress the COVID whistleblowers does not indicate nefarious intent on the whistleblowers' parts. Rather, it highlights the depths of the COVID-19 conspiracy and the importance of the media's role, which I'll return to in Section S. So with that said, here's whistleblower and Yale epidemiologist Dr. Harvey Risch. Risch is one of the leading global authorities in clinical treatment protocols, the editor of 2 scientific journals, and the author of over 350 peer-reviewed research publications. The best practices for defeating an infectious disease epidemic dictate that you quarantine and treat the sick, protect the most vulnerable, and aggressively develop repurposed therapeutic drugs and use early treatment protocols to avoid hospitalizations. Our objective should have been to devise treatments that would reduce hospitalizations and deaths. We could have easily defanged COVID-19 so that it was less lethal than a seasonal flu. We could have done this very quickly. We could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Whistleblower and cardiologist Dr. Peter McCullough, author of 600 peer-reviewed articles, agrees with Risch's assessment. We could have dramatically reduced COVID fatalities and hospitalizations using early treatment protocols and repurposed drugs, including ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and many, many others. The strategy from the outset should have been implementing protocols to stop hospitalizations through early treatment of Americans who tested positive for COVID but were asymptomatic. If we had done that, we could have pushed case fatality rates below those we see with seasonal flu and ended the bottlenecks in our hospitals. We should have rapidly developed off-the-shelf medications with proven safety records and subjected them to a rigorous risk-benefit decision-making. Using repurposed drugs, we could have ended this pandemic by May of 2020 and saved 500,000 lives, but for Dr. Fauci's hard-headed tunnel vision on new vaccines and remdesivir. And here's whistleblower Dr. Pierre Kory, medical director of the Trauma and Life Support Center at the University of Wisconsin Medical School Hospital. The efficacy of some of these early treatment drugs as prophylactics is almost miraculous. Plus, early intervention in the week after exposure stops viral replication and prevents development of cytokine storm and entrance into the pulmonary phase. We could have stopped the pandemic in its tracks in the spring of 2020. Vaccinating citizens with natural immunity should never have been our public health policy. That strategy kept the medical treatment on hold globally for an entire year as a readily treatable respiratory virus ravaged populations. It is absolutely shocking that he recommended no outpatient care, not even vitamin D, despite the fact that he takes it himself and much of the country is vitamin D deficient. I find it appalling there was no consultation process with treating physicians. Medicine is about consultation. You had Birx, Fauci, and Redfield doing press conferences every day and handing down these arbitrary diktats, and not one of them ever treated a COVID patient or worked in an emergency room or ICU. They knew nothing. The outcome we should have been trying to prevent is hospitalizations. You don't just sit around and wait for an infected patient to become ill. Dr. Fauci's treatment strategies all began once all these undermedicated patients were hospitalized. By that time, it was too late for many of them. It was insane, it was perverse, it was unethical. Pandemic frontline responders. Early in the pandemic, Dr. Kory and his mentor, Dr. Paul Marik, created the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance to assemble the world's most highly published and accomplished critical care specialists to rapidly develop functional COVID treatments. Long before he'd ever heard of Dr. Kory and the FLCCC, Dr. McCullough reached the same conclusions about the futility and immorality of the federal effort. As McCullough notes, by April and May, I noticed a disturbing trend. The trend was no effort to treat patients who are infected with COVID-19 at home or in nursing homes. And it almost seemed as if patients were intentionally not being treated, allowed to sit at home and get to the point where they couldn't breathe and then be admitted to the hospital. It was cruelty at a population level. Never in history have doctors deliberately treated patients with this kind of barbarism. McCullough and other frontline doctors quickly uncovered effective COVID remedies. HHS's early studies supported hydroxychloroquine's efficacy against coronavirus, and by March 2020, doctors from New York to Asia were using it against COVID with extraordinary effect. We also had terrific data on ivermectin from the medical teams in Bangladesh and elsewhere by early summer 2020. So now we had 2 cheap generics. McCullough's team recognized that hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and quercetin, a health store nutraceutical, were all effective treatments because they are ionophores, meaning they help zinc uptake in the cells, destroying the capacity of coronavirus to replicate. On August 7, 2020, McCullough and team published a study The Pathophysiologic Basis and Clinical Rationale for Early Treatment of COVID-19 in the American Journal of Medicine, which quickly became the world's most downloaded paper to help doctors treat COVID-19. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons downloaded and turned McCullough's paper into its official treatment guide. Dr. Fauci had never published a single treatment protocol before that. By fall of 2020, more than 200 studies supported treatment with hydroxychloroquine and 60 studies supported ivermectin. Says McCullough, we were able to show that doctors can work with 4 to 6 drugs in combination, supplemented by vitamins and nutraceuticals including zinc, vitamins D and C, and quercetin. And they can guide patients at home, even the highest risk seniors, and avoid a dreaded outcome of hospitalizations and deaths. Fauci fights early treatments. Instead of supporting McCullough's work, NIH and the other federal regulators began actively censoring information on this range of effective remedies. Doctors who attempted merely to open discussion about the potential benefits of early treatments for COVID found themselves heavily and inexplicably censored. Dr. Fauci worked with Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and other social media sites to muzzle discussion of any remedies. In September 2020, McCullough used his own money to create a YouTube video showing 4 slides from his peer-reviewed American Medical Association articles to teach doctors the miraculous benefits of early treatment with hydroxychloroquine and other remedies. His video went viral with hundreds of thousands of downloads. YouTube pulled it 2 days later. This experience was consistent with that of Dr. David Brownstein, a partner at one of the few medical practices in the Detroit area who stayed open during the lockdown. Per Dr. Brownstein, I said, we've been treating viral diseases here for 25 years. COVID can't be any different. In all that time, our office had never lost a single patient to flu or flu-like illness. We treated people in their cars with oral vitamins A, C, and D, and iodine. We administered IV solution outside all winter with IV hydrogen peroxide and vitamin C. We only rarely used ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. We treated 715 patients and had 10 hospitalizations and no deaths. Early treatment was the key. We weren't allowed to talk about it. The whole medical establishment was trying to shut down early treatment and silence all the doctors who talked about successes. A whole generation of doctors just stopped practicing medicine. When we talked about it, the whole cartel came for us. I've been in litigation with the medical board for over a year. When we posted a video from some of our recovered patients, they went viral. One of the videos had 1 million views. FTC filed a motion against us and we had to take everything down. Meanwhile, we've seen lots of really bad vaccine side effects in our patients. We've had 7 strokes, some ending in severe paralysis. We had 3 cases of pulmonary embolism, 2 blood clots, 2 cases of Graves' disease, and 1 death. Experienced physicians and frontline COVID responders believe that Dr. Fauci's suppression of early treatment and off-patent remedies was responsible for up to 80% of the deaths attributed to COVID. Dr. Corey bluntly states, Dr. Fauci's suppression of early treatments will go down in history as having caused the death of 500,000 Americans in the ICU. So how and why did Fauci, Gates, and the rest of the COVID cartel shut down early treatment protocols? To start, an early end to the pandemic posed an existential threat to their $48 billion COVID vaccine project, as well as to the treatment therapy which did receive research funding during the pandemic, remdesivir. As will likely surprise no one, Bill Gates has a large financial stake in Gilead, the multinational pharmaceutical company that manufactures remdesivir. Additionally, under federal law, new vaccines and medicines cannot qualify for emergency use authorization if any existing FDA-approved drugs proves effective against the same disease. Therefore, if drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin proved effective against COVID, pharmaceutical companies would no longer be legally allowed to fast-track their billion-dollar vaccines to market under emergency use authorization. Instead, vaccines would have to endure the years-long delays that have always accompanied methodical safety and efficacy testing and would mean less profit, more uncertainty, longer runways to market, and a disappointing end to the lucrative COVID-19 gold rush. So when President Trump endorsed hydroxychloroquine on March 19, 2020, the COVID cabal hyper-politicized the debate about early treatments, gaining particular support amongst Democrats and the media. Trump's critics claimed this was anti-science and was essentially the same as his notorious recommendation for bleach to cure COVID, despite the fact that hydroxychloroquine had a long history of safe medical use that got lost in the politics and propaganda. Trump had in fact been notified of hydroxychloroquine by Dr. Zev Zelenko, a practicing physician in New York. Dr. Zelenko's protocols have been used effectively for treating 7,000 COVID-19 patients, and he has been nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work. The assassination of hydroxychloroquine. Fauci and the gang had a challenge to prove hydroxychloroquine as dangerous. Hydroxychloroquine is a 65-year-old formula that has been approved by regulators around the world as safe and effective for a variety of illnesses. For decades, WHO has listed hydroxychloroquine as an essential medicine. In the United States, the FDA has approved hydroxychloroquine without limitation for 65 years, meaning that physicians can prescribe it for any off-label use. CDC's information sheet deems hydroxychloroquine safe for pregnant women, breastfeeding women, children, infants, elderly, and immune-compromised patients and healthy persons of all ages. Importantly, hydroxychloroquine is out of patent, meaning cheap generic versions are available worldwide. Despite the drug's history as safe, efficacious, and cheap, in March 2020, Fauci launched his concerted attack on hydroxychloroquine. When asked whether hydroxychloroquine might be used as prophylaxis for COVID, he shouted back, "The answer is no, and the evidence you're talking about is anecdotal evidence." His reliable allies at the New York Times then launched a campaign to defame Dr. Rowe, who'd a few days earlier tweeted his review of hydroxychloroquine as an effective COVID treatment. Then, in March, at HHS's request, several large pharmaceutical companies, Novartis, Bayer, Sanofi, and others, donated their inventory, a total of 63 million doses of hydroxychloroquine and 2 million doses of chloroquine, to the Strategic National Stockpile, managed by BARDA, an agency under the DHHS Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, Colonel Dr. Robert Kadlec. As a reminder, in 1998, Kadlec had written the following in a white paper for the Pentagon. Biological weapons under the cover of an endemic or natural disease occurrence provides an attacker the potential for plausible denial. Biological warfare's potential to create significant economic losses and consequent political instability, coupled with plausible deniability, exceeds the possibilities of any other human weapon. When the COVID pandemic hit in 2020, Kadlec then used his position to stockpile drugs that were safe, efficacious, and cheap treatments for COVID-19 and to keep them out of the hands of the American public. Here's RFK Jr. on Kadlec's deputy, Dr. Rick Bright, the head of BARDA. BARDA's director, Dr. Rick Bright, later claimed that chloroquine drugs were deadly and he needed to protect the American public from them. Bright colluded with FDA to restrict use of the donated pills to hospitalized patients. FDA publicized the authorization using language that led most physicians to believe that prescribing the drug for any purpose was off limits. But at the beginning of June, based on clinical trials that intentionally gave unreasonably high doses to hospitalized patients and failed to start the drug until too late, FDA took the unprecedented step of revoking hydroxychloroquine's emergency authorization, rendering that enormous stockpile of valuable pills off limits to Americans while conveniently indemnifying the pharmaceutical companies for their inventory losses by allowing them a tax break from the donation. Here's whistleblower Dr. Robert Malone, one of the most important developers on mRNA vaccine technology.
Now, when you ask me why, you're asking me to get into somebody's head. What I can say as a scientist is what I observe. The behaviors, the actions, the correspondence, these bizarre things like don't you know it's a horse drug, y'all, right, which is amazingly pejorative. There's clearly been an intentional push. And Zev Zelenko, who's a buddy, the guy that came out with the original protocol, the Zelenko protocol, and was the one, by the way, that wrote the letter to Trump advocating for hydroxychloroquine. Okay, kind of important to put that together. He's put together a great little video clip in which he clearly documents the conspiracy between Janet Woodcock and Rick Bright to make it so that physicians could not administer hydroxychloroquine outside of the hospital.
And who is Janet Woodcock and who's Rick Bright?
Rick Bright was the head of BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research Directorate, which is the group that, for instance, funded the J&J vaccine and Operation Warp Speed, etc. So they're the big-ticket funder in health and human service of biodefense products.
And who is she?
Janet Woodcock was head of Operation Warp Speed for drugs and until very recently head of the FDA. She is known as the person who kind of gets the credit, let's say, for the opioid crisis for her role at the FDA.
So between the two of them, there was some sort of a concerted effort to suppress the use of hydroxychloroquine?
Rick Bright, in videotaped testimony, has explicitly spoken about how they conspired to cook a strategy using emergency use authorization to make it so that hydroxychloroquine could only be administered in the hospital, which, by the way, is too late for when hydroxy should be used.
Bad science to kill good drugs. Then, on May 22nd, 2020, two of the most prestigious medical journals, The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, published two overtly fraudulent studies from a non-existent database owned by a previously unknown company. Here's RFK Jr. Anthony Fauci and the vaccine cartel celebrated the papers as the final nail in hydroxychloroquine's coffin. Both studies in these respected publications relied on data from the Surgisphere Corporation, an obscure Illinois-based medical education company that claimed to somehow control an extraordinary global database boasting access to medical information from 96,000 patients in more than 600 hospitals. Founded in 2008, this sketchy enterprise had 11 employees, including a middling science fiction writer and a porn star/events hostess. Surgisphere claimed to have analyzed data from 6 continents and hundreds of hospitals that had treated patients with hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine in real time. Someone persuaded The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine to publish 2 Surgisphere studies in separate articles on May 1st and 22nd. Like the other Gates-supported studies, the Lancet article portrayed hydroxychloroquine as ineffective and dangerous. The Lancet study said the Surgisphere data proved that hydroxychloroquine increased cardiac mortality in COVID-19 patients. Based on this study, the FDA withdrew its EUA recommendation on June 15, 2020. The WHO and UK suspended their hydroxychloroquine clinical trials on May 25th. Each resumed briefly, then stopped for good in June, declaring hydroxychloroquine unhelpful. 3 European nations immediately banned use of hydroxychloroquine, and others followed within weeks. That would normally have been the end of it, if not for the 200 independent scientists who quickly exposed the Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine studies as shockingly clumsy con jobs. The Surgisphere datasets that formed the foundations of the studies were so ridiculously erroneous that they could only have been a rank invention. To cite one of the many discrepancies, the number of reported deaths among patients taking hydroxychloroquine in one Australian hospital exceeded the total number of deaths for the entire database. An interesting brouhaha quickly revealed that the Surgisphere database did not exist, and soon enough, Surgisphere itself vanished from the internet. The University of Utah terminated the faculty appointment of one of the article's authors, Amit Patel. Surgisphere's founder, Sapanes Desai, disappeared from his job at a Chicago hospital. Even the New York Times reported that more than 100 scientists and clinicians have questioned the authenticity of the database as well as the study's integrity. Despite the barrage of astonished criticism, The Lancet held firm for 2 weeks before relenting to the remonstrances. Finally, 3 of the 4 Lancet co-authors requested the paper be retracted. Both The Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine finally withdrew their studies in shame. Somebody at the very pinnacle of the medical cartel had twisted arms, kicked groins, and stoved in kneecaps to force these periodicals to abandon their policies, shred their ethics, and spend down their centuries of hard-won credibility in a desperate bid to torpedo hydroxychloroquine. To date, neither the authors nor the journals have explained who induced them to co-author and publish the most momentous fraud in the history of scientific publishing. The capacity of their pharma overlords to strong-arm the world's top 2 medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, and to condoning deadly research and to simultaneously publish blatantly fraudulent articles in the middle of a pandemic attest to the cartel's breathtaking power and ruthlessness. It is no longer controversial to acknowledge that drug makers rigorously control medical publishing and that the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and JAMA are utterly corrupt instruments of pharma. The Lancet editor, Richard Horton, confirms journals have devolved into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Marcia Angel, who served as the New England Journal of Medicine editor for 20 years, says that journals are primarily a marketing machine. Pharma, she says, has co-opted every institution that might stand in its way. The FDA blocked access to the millions of doses of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in the Strategic National Stockpile. On June 17, 2020, the World Health Organization, for which Mr. Gates is the largest funder after the US, and over which Mr. Gates and Dr. Fauci exercise tight control, called for the halt of hydroxychloroquine trials in hundreds of hospitals around the world. World Health Organization Chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus ordered nations to stop using hydroxychloroquine. The fraud did not end June, as Gates and the gang concocted broken trials to support their claims of hydroxychloroquine's ineffectiveness. Prior to COVID-19, not a single study had provided evidence against the use of hydroxychloroquine based on safety concerns. In response to the mounting tsunami that hydroxychloroquine was safe and effective against COVID, Gates, Dr. Fauci, and their pharma allies deployed an army of industry-linked researchers to gin up contrived evidence of its dangers. By 2020, Bill Gates exercised firm control over WHO and deployed the agency in his effort to discredit hydroxychloroquine. Dr. Fauci, Bill Gates, and WHO financed a cadre of research mercenaries to concoct a series of nearly 20 studies, all employing fraudulent protocols deliberately designed to discredit hydroxychloroquine as unsafe. Instead of using standard treatment of 400 milligrams per day, the 17 WHO studies administered a borderline lethal daily dose starting with 2,400 milligrams on day 1 and using 800 milligrams per day thereafter. In a cynical, sinister, and literally homicidal crusade against hydroxychloroquine, a team of BMGF operatives played a key role in devising and pushing through the exceptionally high dosing. Per Meryl Nass, physician, medical historian, and biowarfare expert, the purpose seemed very clearly to poison the patients and blame the deaths on hydroxychloroquine. Gates and his cabal used an arsenal of other deceptive gimmickry to assure that hydroxychloroquine would appear not just deadly, but ineffective. Each of the studies that Gates funded failed to incorporate zithromax and zinc, important components of hydroxychloroquine protocols. All of the Fauci, Gates, WHO, Solidarity, Recovery, and REMAP COVID studies administered hydroxychloroquine at late stages of COVID infection in contravention of the prevailing recommendations that deem hydroxychloroquine effective only when doctors administer it early. Viewing this orchestrated sabotage with frustration, critics accuse the Gates grantees of purposefully designing these studies at best to fail and at worst to murder. Brazilian prosecutors have accused the authors of the study of committing homicide by purposefully poisoning the elderly subjects in their study with high doses. In summary, on March 29, 2020, Rick Bright's agency, BARDA, drained inventories of hydroxychloroquine, moving them to the Strategic National Stockpile for possible use in treating patients hospitalized with COVID-19. This snatched vital, early treatment medications away from frontline doctors. Next, in May of 2020, The Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine published 2 fraudulent studies to vilify hydroxychloroquine, both of which were subsequently retracted. Based on these studies, Janet Woodcock's agency, the FDA, revoked the emergency use authorization of hydroxychloroquine for COVID treatments on June 15, 2020. This stopped doctors from being able to use the drugs on infected patients even if they could get their hands on the medication. Finally, Fauci and Gates then conducted and published fraudulent research against hydroxychloroquine, which had been designed to fail. The cascade of corruption has increasingly made it difficult for physicians to legally obtain and prescribe the drug to patients infected with COVID-19, patients who desperately need the treatment. Rerunning the playbook, the assassination of ivermectin. Like hydroxychloroquine, killing ivermectin would prove a challenge due to the drug's impressive, decades-long track record. Before the pandemic, ivermectin had proven to be a fantastic drug against a wide range of human parasites. The Merck scientists who developed this drug in 1996 had won the Nobel Prize for its development, their only award for an infectious disease medication in 60 years. WHO includes ivermectin along with hydroxychloroquine on its inventory of essential medicines, its list of remedies so necessary, safe, efficacious, and affordable that WHO deems easy access to them as essential to satisfy the priority healthcare needs of the population. Researchers at Japan's Kitasato Institute in 2011 published a paper which described ivermectin as follows. There are few drugs that can seriously lay claim to the title of wonder drug, penicillin and aspirin being the 2 that have perhaps had greatest benefit on the health and well-being of mankind. but ivermectin can also be considered alongside these worthy contenders based on its versatility, safety, and the beneficial impact it has had and continues to have worldwide, especially on hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people. On April 3, 2020, researchers at Monash and Melbourne universities in the Royal Melbourne Hospital first brought ivermectin global attention as a potential treatment for COVID with the article entitled "Lab Experiments Show Antiparasitic Drug Ivermectin Eliminates SARS-CoV-2 in 48 Hours." Based on this study, in the summer of 2020, Peru adopted ivermectin in its national guidelines. Doctors in the country already knew the medicine and had widely prescribed it for parasites. COVID deaths dropped meaningfully, 14-fold, in the regions where the Peruvian government effectively distributed ivermectin. Reductions in deaths correlated with the extent of ivermectin distributions in all 25 states. Then, in December 2020, Peru's new president, under pressure from the WHO, severely restricted ivermectin availability and COVID cases rebounded, with deaths increasing 13-fold. On Substack, I've included a chart from the journal article showing this drop and subsequent rebound of COVID deaths in Peru. The coordinated criminal conspiracy to shut down ivermectin played out much the same way as the suppression of hydroxychloroquine. Some of the highlights include the corruption of Dr. Andrew Hill, the WHO's meta-analysis author. Hill had initially supported the analysis of Dr. Corey regarding ivermectin as a safe and efficacious treatment for COVID-19. Speaking with Dr. Corey to the National Institutes of Health COVID-19 Guidelines panel in early January 2021. Hill's meta-analysis of 6 ivermectin studies showed a cumulative 75% reduction of risk of death in a subset of moderate to severe COVID-19 patients in whom the drug reduced inflammation and sped up elimination of the virus. Per RFK Jr., 10 days after the presentation, the NIH's COVID-19 Treatment Guidelines panel changed its previously negative recommendation to doctors regarding ivermectin to neither for nor against, cracking open the door just a little for physicians to use ivermectin as a therapeutic option. NIH's neutral January 14, 2021 non-recommendation, issued in the face of strong evidence of ivermectin's safety and efficacy for COVID-19, was the first obvious sign of the agency's determination to suppress ivermectin. NIH claimed there was insufficient evidence to recommend either for or against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. Around this time, Dr. Tess Lawrie published a highly regarded, peer-reviewed meta-analysis in favor of ivermectin. Dr. Lawrie assessed 15 trials, finding a cumulative benefit of ivermectin in reducing deaths by 62%. They also showed that ivermectin prophylaxis reduced COVID infections by 86%. Dr. Hill, on the other hand, made a dramatic change in the conclusions of his meta-review of ivermectin. The 7 studies in his review still showed a dramatic reduction in hospitalizations and deaths among patients receiving ivermectin. However, now he claimed that those studies comprised a low quality of evidence, and so although they yielded a highly positive result, Hill assigned the result a low certainty. He could then declare the WHO should not recommend ivermectin without performing long-term, randomized, placebo-controlled studies that would require many months, if not longer. Says Dr. Corey, someone got to him. Andrew Hill has been captured by some really dark forces. Dr. Tess Lawrie was able to connect with Dr. Hill on a recorded January 18th Zoom call to question the methodology of his meta-review and the inexplicable change in the conclusions of his evidence. Dr. Lawrie asked, "You don't just do a meta-analysis when there's all those other outcomes that you didn't even meta-analyze. You just meta-analyzed the death outcomes using a fraction of the available evidence and then said, oh, we need more studies." Hill explained he was in a tricky situation because his sponsors had put pressure on him. Hill is a University of Liverpool virologist who serves as an advisor to Bill Gates and the Clinton Foundation. His sponsor was Unitaid, a quasi-governmental advocacy organization funded by the BMFG in several countries to lobby governments to finance the purchase of medicines from pharmaceutical multinationals for distribution to the African poor. Its primary purpose seems to be protecting the patent and IP rights of pharma companies, a similar passion to Bill Gates, and to ensure their prompt and full payment. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation holds a board seat and chairs Unitaid's executive committee, and the BMGF has given Unitaid $150 million since 2006. Various Gates-funded surrogate and front organizations like Global Fund, Gavi, and UNICEF also contribute, as does the pharmaceutical industry. The BMGF and Gates personally own large stakes in many of the companies that profit from this boondoggle. Gates also uses Unitaid to fund corrupt science by tame and compromised researchers like Hill that legitimizes his policy directives to the WHO. Unitaid gave $40 million to Andrew Hill's employer, the University of Liverpool, 4 days before the publication of Hill's study. Hill confessed that the sponsors were pressuring him to influence his conclusion. Here's a piece of the conversation between Dr. Hill and Dr. Laurie on that recorded Zoom call.
I think I'm in a very sensitive position here. What I'm trying to do...
People are in sensitive positions. They're in hospital and ICUs dying and they need this medicine.
Well...
This is what I don't get, because you're not a clinician, you're not at the coalface, you're not seeing people dying every day. And this medicine prevents deaths by 80%. So 80% of those people who are dying today don't need to die because there's ivermectin.
There are a lot, as I said, there are a lot of different opinions about this. As I said, some people...
We're looking at the data. It doesn't matter what other people say. We are the ones who are tasked with and we have the experience to look at the data and reassure everybody that this cheap and effective treatment will save lives. It's clear. You don't have to say, well, so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that. It's absolutely crystal clear. We can save lives today if we can get the government to buy ivermectin. Whose conclusions are those on the review that you've done? Who's not listed as an author, who's actually contributed?
Well, I mean, I don't really want to get into... I mean,
I think it needs to be clear. I would like to know who are these other voices that are in your paper that are not acknowledged. Does Unitaid have a say? Do they influence what you write?
Unitaid has a say in the conclusions of the paper, yeah.
Okay, so who is it in Unitaid then who is sharing who is giving you opinion on your evidence?
Well, it's just the people there. I thought
Unitaid is just a charity. Is it not a charity?
Yeah.
That actually so they have a say in your conclusions.
Yeah. Rest assured, I'm not going to let this last for a long time. I'm not saying we keep going for another year.
The fact that you're saying you're not going to let it last for a long time makes you realize the impact of your work. So how long are you going to let people carry on dying unnecessarily? Up to you. What is the timeline that you've allowed for this then?
Well, I think then it goes to the WHO and the NIH and the FDA and the EMEA, and they've got to decide when they think enough's enough.
And how do they decide? Because there's nobody giving them good evidence synthesis, because yours is certainly not good.
Well, when yours comes out, which will be in the very near future, at the same time, there'll be other trials producing results which will nail it with a bit of luck, and we'll be there.
It is already nailed.
Well, what I hope is that this stalemate that we're in doesn't last very long. It lasts a matter of weeks, and I guarantee I will push for this to last for as short amount of time as possible.
So how long do you think the stalemate will go on for? How long do you think your
well, okay,
is going to allow the stalemate to go on for?
From my side, every single new trial that comes through, we're going to be aggressively adding it on, and I think end of Feb we'll be there. 6 weeks.
How many people die every day?
Well, there is a whole group of people who think that ivermectin is complete rubbish.
I'm not talking about them. I'm saying we know the evidence. How many people die every day?
Oh, sure. I mean, 15,000 people a day.
15,000 people a day times 6 weeks.
Yeah, sure.
First
I get
you have to try and get it into the UK, because at this rate, all other countries are getting ivermectin accepted.
My goal is to get the drug approved and to do everything I can to get it approved so it reaches the maximum.
Well, you're not doing everything you can, because everything you can will involve saying to those people who are paying you, I can see this prevents deaths, so I'm not going to support this conclusion anymore. And I'm going to tell the truth.
Merck kills ivermectin. Then the coordinated fraud extended further when Merck, the massive pharmaceutical multinational company that developed ivermectin, took steps to kill its own medicine. Listeners will remember George Merck, the company's founder, effectively founded the bioweapons industry. Lovely organization, that one. Per RFK Jr., during the early industry offensive against hydroxychloroquine, one of the drug's principal manufacturers, Sanofi, suddenly detected safety concerns with hydroxychloroquine that it had never noticed during decades of profitable sales. Sanofi suddenly detected safety concerns with hydroxychloroquine that it had never noticed during decades of profitable sales. In a remarkable coincidence, on February 4th, 2021, Merck similarly discovered a concerning lack of safety data in the majority of studies regarding ivermectin. Merck was ivermectin's original manufacturer and had formerly boasted of ivermectin as its wonder drug. During the 40 years that it marketed the drug worldwide, Merck had never spoken of these worrisome safety signals. Since 1987, Merck had given billions of doses to the developing world without any safety alarms. What prompted Merck's sudden safety concerns? Merck's exclusive rights expired in 1996, and dozens of generic drug companies now produce ivermectin for about 40 cents per dose, badly diminishing ivermectin's profit profile for Merck. Furthermore, only 10 days before Merck discovered its concerns about ivermectin, Merck signed a manufacturing partnership for the Novavax and Emergent Biosolutions COVID vaccine as it moved into final trials. But most importantly, ivermectin is also a low-profit competitor for another new Merck product for COVID-19, molnupiravir, for which Merck had the highest financial ambitions. Ironically, molnupiravir, a copycat formula, utilized an identical mechanism of action as ivermectin. That drug will retail at around $700 per course, but only if Merck can kill its cheap rival. I could go on and on about the corruption that occurred by the COVID cabal as it relates to early treatment protocols, but you get the point. The most important takeaway is this. Had we used early treatment protocols as recommended by the frontline doctors, the pandemic could have been stopped in its tracks in early 2020. But that was never the point. This pre-planned, coordinated pandemic was meant to maximize profits for Big Pharma and the other parties of the COVID cabal. The millions of lives lost, the livelihoods ruined, the economic losses to humans all around the world, that was all part of the plan too. What we witnessed here was inhumanity, cruelty, and criminal conspiracy at a global level. Dr. Lori's mic drop. Dr. Lori summarized the situation beautifully in her closing speech at the British Ivermectin Recommendation Development Conference on April 25th, 2021. I've included her 8-minute speech here in full. If you take nothing else away from today's episode, please consider her words.
But before we end, I would like to share with you a few reflections on ivermectin and the state of affairs with regard to evidence-based medicine. As a scientist tasked with providing evidence along evidence-based medicine principles, I have become aware that the hierarchical approach to evidence synthesis, where systematic reviews sit at the top of the evidence pyramid and expert opinion and consensus at the bottom, is no longer appropriate. This is partly because the integrity of systematic reviews and meta-analysis has become degraded by the increasing requirements about the conduct of randomized controlled trials, the considered gold standard of clinical studies, that favor the pharmaceutical industry. Large randomized trials have become hugely resource-intensive. 70-page trial protocols and grant applications require months of time and expertise to jump through all the hoops required for processing and authorization. In addition, they cost millions of dollars. These requirements play into the hands of Big Pharma, who are the only ones who can afford such trials. Large randomized clinical trials of generic medicines and non-pharmaceutical interventions, which deserve to be evaluated for a number of viral and cancerous conditions, are rare because, frankly, there is no money to be made and there is no funding available. In my experience of evaluating trial reports of novel anti-cancer agents, it is common that early trial findings showing benefit leading to the drug's approval are contradicted by later evidence showing no benefit. By then, the drug has already been licensed for use, and the pharmaceutical company has already made billions. For this reason, I caution against the unquestioning acceptance of data provided by the developers of novel treatments and strongly suggest these need independent evaluation. Not by academics and institutions receiving unlimited research grants and funding from the pharmaceutical industry and their associated fund companies and charities, but by independent, objective scientists with no conflicts of interest. It is time we recognize and scrutinize the involvement of industry and institutions once known for their scientific integrity, and all the so-called public-private partnerships and charitable foundations that have facilitated the corruption of science and our honorable profession, healing. They who design the trials and control the data also control the outcome. So this system and focus of industry-led trials needs to be put to an end. Data from ongoing and future trials of novel COVID treatments must be independently controlled and analyzed. Anything less than total transparency cannot be trusted. With regard to the evidence pyramid, there needs to be a new approach, an integrated evidence approach, instead of a tiered hierarchical approach. Instead of a pyramid, in my opinion, a circle would be more appropriate, where the center represents the integrated body of evidence from different sources. Systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized trials would then represent one of several types of evidence, including observational studies, real-world data, qualitative data on people's views and experiences, and doctors' expert opinion. This would inform clinical practice decision-making in a much more holistic way. All of these different types of data are critical to the big picture, and integration of these data has been absent in the evaluation of all interventions imposed on the public over the course of the last year. Instead, authorities have cherry-picked science and the scientists to support their flawed decision-making processes. The story of ivermectin has highlighted that we are at a remarkable juncture in medical history, where rigorous scientific evidence, our training and experience, the tools that we use to heal, and our connection with our patients are being systematically undermined by relentless disinformation stemming from corporate greed. The story of ivermectin shows that we as the public have misplaced our trust in the authorities and have underestimated the extent to which money and power corrupts. Had ivermectin been employed in 2020, when medical colleagues around the world first alerted the authorities to its efficacy, millions of lives could have been saved, and the pandemic, with all of the associated suffering and loss, brought to a rapid and timely end. Since then, hundreds of millions of people have been involved in the largest medical experiment in human history, mass vaccination with an unproven novel therapy. Hundreds of billions will be made by Big Pharma and paid for by the public. With politicians and other non-medical individuals dictating to us what we are allowed to prescribe to the ill, we as doctors have been put in a position such that our ability to uphold our Hippocratic oath is under attack. At this fateful juncture, we must therefore choose. Will we continue to be held ransom by corrupt organizations, health authorities, big pharma, and billionaire sociopaths? Or will we do our moral and professional duty to do no harm and always do the best for those in our care? The latter includes urgently reaching out to colleagues around the world to discuss which of our tried and tested safe older medicines can be used against COVID, holding medical forums free of conflict of interest like this one, and banding together as health professionals to stand up to the medical tyranny that has been imposed on us and the public over the past year. To this end, I suggest we form a new World Health Organization, a health organization that represents the interests and well-being of the people, not corporations and billionaires. An organization focused on optimizing human health and potential, not contraception and population control. A people-centered organization. And never before has our role as doctors been more important, because never before have we been complicit in potentially causing so much harm. I ask all doctors here today to look into their hearts and remember their oath so that we can move forward united in the protection of those we serve and with the greatest of courage. Thank you.
Section R, March 2020 to present, all in on vaccines. Leaky vaccines and pathogenic priming. Fauci's decision to focus the crisis response on vaccine development was particularly suspicious because before the pandemic, researchers had spent decades unsuccessfully attempting to craft coronavirus vaccines. Two seemingly insurmountable impediments had thwarted those attempts. First, leaky vaccines, and second, pathogenic priming. Leaky vaccines refer to the coronavirus's tendency to rapidly mutate, producing vaccine-resistant variants. Early on, vaccinologists Drs. Peter Hotez and Paul Offit regarded the Fauci-Gates projections of a miraculous vaccine to stop the pandemic as far-fetched and foolhardy. Here's RFK Jr. discussing the leaky vaccine issue. Vaccine developers doubted that after decades of futile efforts, researchers could suddenly develop a coronavirus vaccine that would provide sterilizing immunity, meaning that it would completely obliterate viral colonies in vaccinated individuals and prevent transmission and mutation. Leading virologists, including Nobel laureate Luc Montagnier, pointed out that a non-sterilizing or leaky vaccine could not arrest transmission and would therefore fail to stop the pandemic. Even worse, vaccinated individuals, he warned, would become asymptomatic carriers and mutant factories, blasting out vaccine-resistant versions of the disease that were likely to lengthen and intensify rather than abbreviate the pandemic. But Tony Fauci and his partner Bill Gates seemed to have a strategy for neutralizing the variant threat. The two men had put billions of taxpayer and tax-deduced dollars into developing an mRNA platform that, in theory, would allow them to quickly produce new boosters to combat each new escape variant. This scheme was Big Pharma's holy grail. Vaccines are one of the rare commercial products that multiply profits by failing. Each new booster doubles the revenue from the initial jab. Since NIAID co-owned the mRNA patent, the agency stood to make billions from its coronavirus gambit by producing successive boosters for every new variant. The more, the better. The good news for Pharma was that all of humanity would be permanently dependent on biannual or even triannual booster shots. Dr. McCullough warned that mass vaccination with a leaky vaccine during a pandemic would put the world on a never-ending booster treadmill. That kind of talk had Pharma popping champagne corks. In October 2021, Pfizer announced that it was projecting an astonishing $26 billion in revenues from its COVID boosters. The second, bigger issue for the COVID-19 vaccine developers relates to the phenomenon of pathogenic priming. The even more daunting obstacle to coronavirus vaccines was their tendency to induce pathogenic priming, also known as antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE, an overstimulation of immune system response that can cause severe injuries and death when vaccinated individuals subsequently encounter the wild viruses. In early experiments, coronavirus vaccines produced a robust immune response in both animals and children, temporarily heartening researchers, but then tragically killing the vaccine recipients upon re-exposure to the wild virus or making them vulnerable to uniquely debilitating infections. Even Dr. Fauci, during his March 26, 2020 White House coronavirus briefing, acknowledged the perils of pathogenic priming.
Now, the issue of safety, something that I want to make sure the American public understand. It's not only safety when you inject somebody and they get maybe an idiosyncratic reaction, they get a little allergic reaction, they get pain. There's safety associated. Does the vaccine make you worse? And there are diseases in which you vaccinate someone they get infected with what you're trying to protect them with, and you actually enhance the infection. You can get a good feel for that in animal models. So that's going to be interspersed at the same time that we're testing. We're going to try and make sure we don't have enhancement. So the worst possible thing you could do is vaccinate somebody to prevent infection and actually make them worse.
Dr. Fauci must have realized that since vaccine makers had immunity from liability, which he helped arrange, and were playing, as it were, with house money, which he diverted to them through NIH, these companies had little incentive to invest in the kind of long-term studies necessary to eliminate the pathogenic priming hazard. In retrospect, it seems that Dr. Fauci and his confederates had at least 6 strategies for dealing with this grim risk. All 6 tactics involved hiding the evidence of ADE if it did occur. Number 1, abort the 3-year clinical trials at 6 months and then vaccinate the controls, a preemption that would prevent detection of long-term injuries, including pathogenic priming. Number 2, as COVID czar, Dr. Fauci stubbornly refused to fix HHS's designed-to-fail vaccine injury system VAERS, which systematically suppresses reporting of most vaccine injuries. A 2010 HHS study of the government's notoriously dysfunctional VAERS concluded that VAERS detects fewer than 1% of vaccine injuries. Number 3, Dr. Fauci's trump card was his capacity to enlist mainstream and social media companies to make reporting of injuries and deaths disappear from the airwaves, newspapers, and the internet, and therefore from the public consciousness. Number 4, Dr. Fauci allowed CDC to discourage autopsies and deaths following vaccination. Number 5, Dr. Fauci populated the key FDA and CDC committees with NIAID, NIH, and Gates Foundation grantees and loyalists to ensure rubber stamp approvals for his mRNA vaccines without any long-term injury studies. And number 6, by vaccinating the entire population, Dr. Fauci seems to be striving to eliminate the control group to hide vaccine injuries. Operation Warp Speed and vaccine trial chicanery. So how did the vaccine rollout actually proceed? During the pandemic, the U.S. government, through the end of 2020, funded $12.4 billion for vaccine development and manufacturing as part of Operation Warp Speed. Over $4 billion went to Moderna, about $2 billion went to Pfizer, $2 billion to Sanofi GlaxoSmithKline, $1.5 billion to Johnson & Johnson, $1.5 billion to Novavax, and about $1 billion to AstraZeneca Oxford. Pfizer's COVID vaccine, Comirnaty, was the first to win FDA approval in November 2021. Through August 22, 2022, U.S. health officials had administered more than 360 million doses of Pfizer's COVID vaccine, 229 million doses of Moderna's, and 18 million doses of Johnson & Johnson's. Here's RFK Jr. on the 6-month Pfizer vaccine trial. The final summary of the trial data, the document that Pfizer submitted to FDA to win approval, revealed one key data point that should have killed the intervention forever. Far more people died in the vaccine group than in the placebo group during Pfizer's clinical trials. The fact that FDA nevertheless granted Pfizer full approval and that the medical community embraced and prescribed this intervention for their patients is eloquent testimony to the resilience of even the most deadly and inefficacious products and the breathtaking power of the pharmaceutical industry and its government allies to control the narrative through captive regulators, compliant physicians, and media manipulation, and to overwhelm the fundamental common sense of much of humanity. Pfizer's Table S4 summarized death from Pfizer's 6-month clinical trial. This was Pfizer's final report to FDA. The study by then was unblinded and over. As anyone can see, Pfizer won FDA's approval despite the rather pathetic showing that its vaccine might prevent 1 COVID death in every 22,000 vaccine recipients. So how did Pfizer transform its unimpressive record of eliminating a single COVID fatality among 22,000 vaccinated subjects into a $5 billion per year success story? By guiling the public with a deceptive measure called relative risk instead of the presumptive and far more useful measure of absolute risk. The table shows that during the 6-month trial, 2 people in the placebo group, numbering approximately 22,000, and only 1 in the similarly sized vaccine group died from COVID. Believe it or not, this data point is the source of Pfizer's claim that the vaccine is 100% efficacious against death. Since only 1 person died from COVID in the vaccine group and 2 died in the placebo group, Pfizer can technically represent that the vaccine is 100% improvement over the placebo. The media winked at this canard, obligingly reporting Pfizer's extraordinary 100% efficacy claim. At least some reporters must have understood that most Americans hearing the statistic would naturally believe that the vaccine would prevent 100% of deaths. A more honest and helpful way of thinking about the Pfizer vaccine's efficacy is to consider that 22,000 vaccines must be given to save a single life from COVID. Equally concerning, every virologist and infectious disease expert knew that the true reduction in risk is 1 out of 22,000, or about 0.01%. As the BMH reported, was far too insignificant to make the vaccine even a minor barrier against the spread of COVID. Because the clinical trial showed the vaccines reduce absolute risk less than 1%, those vaccines can't possibly influence epidemic curves. It's mathematically impossible, explains Peter McCullough. Nevertheless, Dr. Fauci continues to promote the vaccines as the ultimate panacea. But the story gets even worse. As Table S4 shows, this entire meager advantage of preventing a single COVID death in every 22,000 vaccinated individuals, 1 out of 22,000, is entirely canceled out by a 5-fold increase in excess fatal cardiac arrests and congenital heart failures in vaccinated individuals, 5 out of 22,000. Pfizer and its regulatory magician, Dr. Fauci, used smoke and mirrors to divert public attention from the all-important question of all-cause mortality. Pfizer's 6-month clinical data for its COVID vaccine trials suggested that while the vaccine would avert a single death from COVID-19, the vaccinated group suffered 4x the number of lethal heart attacks as the unvaccinated. In other words, there was no mortality benefit from the vaccines. For every life saved from COVID, there were 4 excess heart attack fatalities. 20 people died of all-cause mortality among the 22,000 recipients in Pfizer's vaccine group versus only 14 in the numerically comparable placebo group. Pfizer was evidently so alarmed by the total number of deaths in its vaccine cohort that it omitted 5 of them from Table S4 and only disclosed them in fine print buried in the body of its report. That means there were 42.8% more deaths in the vaccine than in the placebo group. Under FDA guidelines, researchers must attribute all injuries and deaths among the study group during clinical trials to the intervention, the vaccine, unless proven otherwise. Under this rule, the FDA must assume people who take the vaccine have a 42.8% increased risk of dying. This 6-month safety report was so damning that it should have closed the case against the vaccine, but captured FDA officials nevertheless gave Pfizer the approval. The broken VAERS system and the mainstream and social media all conspired to conceal the evidence of the crime when vaccinated Americans began dying in droves. Dr. Fauci and the vaccine lobby began an opportunistic campaign of deception by claiming credit for their jabs when COVID-19 deaths dropped precipitously in mid-December 2020, just after the vaccine rollout began. But the Pfizer jab had reached only 27 million Americans, about 8% of the population by February 1st, and according to the CDC, the jab takes at least 60 days to provide protection, so vaccines had little, if anything, to do with the drop. The January drop-off was probably from natural herd immunity, thanks to the spread of natural infections over the previous year and widespread use of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine following Pierre Corey's December 5th Senate testimony, and the proliferation of 6 nationwide telemedicine clinics and several large networks of independent physicians that began early treatments of about 1/4 to 1/3 of all new infections in January. Despite CDC's efforts to hide the carnage in the U.S., even the dysfunctional VAERS system has recorded unprecedented waves of documented deaths following COVID vaccines. In 1976, U.S. regulators pulled the swine flu after it was linked to 25 deaths. In contrast, between December 14th, 2020 and October 1st, 2021, American doctors and bereaved families have reported more than 16,000 deaths and a total of 778,685 injuries to the VAERS following COVID vaccination. The Europeans' surveillance sites tallied 40,000 deaths and 2.2 million adverse reactions. Due to chronic undercounting by VAERS and its European sister system, those numbers are almost certainly only a fraction of the true injuries. Other databases have, not surprisingly, yielded much higher projections of COVID vaccine deaths than VAERS. A September 2021 analysis by a team of prominent scientists and mathematicians convened by Silicon Valley entrepreneur Steve Kirsch of half a dozen population and surveillance system databases, including VAERS, using 8 different independent methods, attributes 150,000 deaths to COVID vaccines in the United States since January 2020. Kirsch has offered $1 million reward for anyone who finds an error in this calculation. Kirsch's study, which found that the vaccines kill more people than they save in every age range, was consistent with Pfizer's 6-month clinical trial, finding that people who took the vaccine were more likely to die than people who didn't take the vaccine. there were a total of 20 deaths in the people who took the vaccine versus 14 deaths in the people who didn't take the vaccine. We'll dive into exactly how the COVID cartel covered up vaccine deaths and injuries in part 2 of this outro when we return to Maddie to Garay's story. The end result of this systemic corruption and falsified science has been a massive windfall for Big Pharma at the expense of public health and the American taxpayer. Not only did these pharmaceutical companies not have to repay the government's Operation Warp Speed investment, the successful ones were able to sell their COVID-19 vaccines at significant markups. Pfizer projected $32 billion worth of COVID-19 vaccine sales in 2022, down slightly from the $36.7 billion in COVID-19 sales generated in 2021, which represented 45% of Pfizer's total revenues for the year. Moderna projects $19 billion in COVID-19 vaccine sales for 2022, up slightly from $17.7 billion in 2021. Moderna's COVID vaccine is the company's only commercially viable product and represents effectively all of the company's revenue. So in total, these companies will be receiving over $105 billion in revenue for the respected COVID-19 vaccines over 2 years. And none of the over $6 billion they received from the American taxpayers for developing and manufacturing their vaccines needs to be repaid. That's one hell of a return on an investment, if you ask me. Especially for vaccines that do not work and that cause more harm than good. Section S, March 2020 to present, censorship of big media and big tech. Up to this point, the listeners may understandably be incredulous regarding the allegations of corruption I've discussed. After all, if this corruption, immorality, and criminality was so pervasive, how the hell is it possible more people weren't made aware of this? This is exactly why the implications here are so profound and so urgent. While men like Fauci, Gates, and Kadlec were some of the masterminds behind this orchestrated false flag attack, they could not and did not act alone. This pre-planned, pre-coordinated pandemic involved many of the most powerful organizations in the world, active and complicit in this organized crime. The members of this cartel include at least the following organizations: public health regulatory bodies including the NIH and NIAID, HHS, the FDA, the CDC, BARDA, and a laundry list of both the Republican and Democratic politicians. Allegedly independent NGOs and charities like the BMGF, the Wellcome Trust, the WHO, the Clinton Foundation, UNITAID, the World Economic Forum, the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, Gavi, UNICEF, and the Global Fund. Organizations tied to the intelligence agencies including the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the DoD, the Department of Homeland Security, In-Q-Tel, DARPA, the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Fort Detrick, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Pharmaceutical companies including Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and GlaxoSmithKline. Medical journals and academic institutions such as The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Liverpool. Tech platforms including Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Wikipedia, Twitter, Snopes, and PolitiFact. Media companies including the 6 conglomerates that own 90% of U.S. platforms: Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Fox Corporation, Sony, and Paramount Global, and all of their associated subsidiaries including CBS, CNN, Fox News, ABC, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Reuters, etc., etc., etc. Chinese government officials, intelligence agencies, and medical professionals, and government officials, regulatory agencies, intelligence agencies, and media outlets across other countries all over the world. Here I'd like to drill in on exactly how and why the big media and big tech platforms were instrumental in facilitating this global conspiracy, and why this has caused such significant cognitive dissonance between the actions taken by the leaders of the pandemic response and the members of the general public. First, the media is essentially owned by Big Pharma due to their exorbitant advertising spend of $9.6 billion annually. For example, in 2014, Fox News Network President Roger Ailes told RFK Jr. that he would fire any of his news show hosts who allowed RFK to talk about vaccine safety on air. Our news division, he explained, gets up to 70% of ad revenues from pharma in non-election years. Additionally, the most important big tech platform as it relates to information flow, Google also has significant interest in vaccine development through their parent company's subsidiary, Verily. Number 2, the intelligence agencies' corrosive influence on big tech and media. The intelligence agencies have been involved since day one in most of the biggest tech companies today and have spent decades infiltrating the media as discussed earlier with the Church Committee hearings. The The intelligence agencies themselves have always been controlled by the cabal since the CIA was created in the aftermath of World War II. And number 3, the further infiltration of big tech and big media through cabal-controlled organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission. These 3 groups are in turn extensions of arguably the most important cabal-controlled organization, the Federal Reserve System. First, I'll start by highlighting some of the ways the media and tech platforms distorted realities to support the COVID cabal's agenda. These organizations widely spread misinformation while simultaneously censoring and gaslighting anyone who challenged their narrative on trumped-up hypocritical allegations of doing the same. I'll then discuss evidence of the intelligence agency's influence on tech and media before and during the pandemic. Finally, I'll dive into the long, dark history of the Federal Reserve, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission. This discussion should demonstrate that this global conspiracy of one world government is not a fairy tale. It is not some nonsense cooked up by anarchists or terrorists. This drive towards a one-world government, dubbed the Great Reset throughout the pandemic, is proceeding exactly as planned for centuries and will succeed unless we nip it in the bud now. The media suppresses early treatment protocols, unquestioningly endorses vaccines. Here's RFK Jr. discussing some examples of the media's cooperation in the COVID-19 corruption. On March 13, 2020, a Michigan doctor, James Todaro, tweeted his review of hydroxychloroquine as an effective COVID treatment, including a link to a public Google Doc. Google quietly scrubbed Dr. Todaro's memo. This was 6 days before the president endorsed hydroxychloroquine. Google apparently didn't want users to think Todaro's message was missing. Rather, the big tech platform wanted the public to believe that Todaro's memo never even existed. Google has a long history of suppressing information that challenges vaccine industry profits. Google's parent company Alphabet owns several vaccine companies, including Verily, as well as Vastatech, a company banking on flu, prostate, and COVID vaccines. Google has lucrative partnerships with all the large vaccine manufacturers, including a $750 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline. Verily also owns a business that tests for COVID infection. Google was not the only social media platform to ban content that contradicts the official hydroxychloroquine narrative. Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, MailChimp, and virtually every other big tech platform began scrubbing information demonstrating hydroxychloroquine's efficacy, replacing it with industry propaganda generated by one of the Dr. Fauci Gates-controlled public health agencies, HHS, NIH, and WHO. When President Trump later suggested that Dr. Fauci was not being truthful about hydroxychloroquine, social media responded by removing his posts. In July 2020, Gates endorsed censorship of hydroxychloroquine recommendations after a video touting its efficacy against coronavirus accumulated tens of millions of views. Gates called the video outrageous and praised Facebook and YouTube for hastily removing it. Asked by Bloomberg News in mid-August about how the Trump White House had promoted hydroxychloroquine despite it repeatedly being shown to be ineffective and, in fact, to cause heart problems in some patients, Gates happily responded, "This is an age of science, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way. In the test tube, hydroxychloroquine looked good. On the other hand, there are lots of good therapeutic drugs coming along that are proven to work without the severe side effects." Gates went on to promote Gilead's remdesivir as the best alternative, despite its lackluster track record compared to hydroxychloroquine. He didn't mention having a large stake in Gilead, which stood to make billions if Dr. Fauci was able to run remdesivir through the regulatory traps. Following the vaccine rollouts, Facebook, Google, and the television networks purged doctors and scientists who reported pathogenic priming and censored reports about the waves of other vaccine injuries. As a federal official sworn for 4 decades to uphold the Constitution, Dr. Fauci should have been the champion of free speech and vigorous debate during the pandemic. Instead, he worked hand in glove with Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and other big tech titans to censor criticism of his various mandates and suppress information about vaccine injuries, including discussions of pathogenic priming. Email traffic shows that Dr. Fauci colluded directly with Mark Zuckerberg and the social media platforms to censor doctors who reported vaccine failures, harms, and deaths, to deplatform public health advocates like RFK Jr., and to evict and muzzle patients who reported their own injuries. The science journals, utterly dependent on pharma advertising, obligingly refused to publish studies on the rash of deadly and debilitating jab reactions. The Bill Gates-funded fact-checking organization PolitiFact worked with pharma-funded fact-checkers like FactCheck, which receives funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which owns $1.8 billion in Johnson & Johnson stock and whose CEO is Richard Besser, former acting head of the CDC, to debunk stories and studies of vaccine injuries. Beginning in March 2020, Amazon would outright ban or throttle the delivery of entire categories of books and videos that questioned official orthodoxies, including the scientific basis for the lockdown that would multiply Bezos' worth by tens of billions. Apparently anticipating rich returns to big tech from the lockdown he would orchestrate, Gates was, by then, among the largest shareholders of Amazon, Google, Facebook, and of course, Microsoft. Blatant lies, calling ivermectin a horse drug. Then, of course, as I'm sure listeners will remember, we had the coordinated invective from the media labeling it a horse drug. Here's RFK Jr. As Merck stood poised to release molnupiravir onto the market, the other US behemoth, Pfizer, was racing Merck neck and neck with its own antiviral pill, PF07321332, an ivermectin knockoff that is so similar to ivermectin, except of course in price point, that critics call it Pfizermectin. With these two drugs teed up for a simultaneous FDA approval, the entire medical media cartel launched a final coordinated coup de grace against ivermectin, branding it a dangerous horse drug. Mainstream media outlets across the US and overseas obediently ran stories promoting the horse medicine propaganda scam. In late August 2021, NIH, FDA, and CDC launched an innovative new campaign to slander ivermectin as a horse dewormer that only deluded foolhardy nincompoops would consume. Picking up those themes, The Independent asked, ivermectin, why are US anti-vaxxers touting a horse dewormer as a cure for COVID? On August 15th, the FDA instructed on its website, you are not a horse. In an August 21st, 2021 Twitter post, the FDA expanded the theme. You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it. The White House and CNN also urged listeners that they should avoid veterinary products. CDC joined the chorus, warning Americans to not risk their health consuming a horse dewormer. Here's a selection of some of the media propaganda that followed.
So things are clearly bad, but they're being made even worse by people who have refused to take the vaccine and instead are swallowing horse paste.
Horse dewormer. There's no clinical evidence that indicates that this works.
It goes beyond that. We actually know that it doesn't work.
Ivermectin is ineffective against COVID,
but could put you in a coma.
It can kill you. It can kill you.
And here are whistleblowers Doctors Paul Merrick, Pierre Corey, Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, and Richard Bartlett discussing the media lies and how the cabal came after them personally when they refused to be bullied into self-censorship.
You are more likely to die from taking Tylenol than ivermectin, yet the FDA calls this a dangerous horse deworming medicine.
What initially led this was an FDA Twitter account that used the term y'all to express denigration of ivermectin as a horse drug. I have horses. The truth is that the dose that's used for horses by body weight is the same dose that's recommended for humans, but it's formulated and manufactured to a quality standard that's very different.
Lots of medicines are used in both animals and humans, so it's not a sufficient argument for somebody to say, it's a horse dewormer.
Yesterday, the CDC put out a national advisory on this, warning the whole country against taking this drug, ivermectin, formulated for horses and cows and sheep.
With that memo fired to every doctor, then suddenly me and all my early treatment colleagues around the country, we were faced with problems like we'd never had before.
I work as an emergency room doctor. And not only an emergency room doctor, I teach advanced trauma life support, a course to other doctors that want to work in the emergency room on how to stabilize patients. We were being told there's nothing you can do. Just wait for Fauci and the FDA to acknowledge a vaccine that they were going to create, and there's no treatment, they said. Why would you want to decrease access to quality life-saving measures for people who are fighting a worldwide pandemic?
So it was the first time in history that we ever saw a doctor who could be prosecuted for using a generic, safe, and effective drug for the application that doctor thought was appropriate.
My group of five, the core five of us ICU doctors, collectively were some of the most highly published doctors in the history of critical care medicine. Paul Merrick is the most published practicing intensivist in the world.
As we sit here today, I'm the most published person in my field in history. But when COVID-19 hit, my clinical and academic world was turned upside down.
Twitter, in its wisdom, has decided to suspend the account of Dr. Robert Malone,
Now, Robert Malone happens to be the inventor of the mRNA technology of making vaccines. His Twitter account has been suspended because he was allegedly spreading misinformation on COVID-19 vaccines. Let that sink in.
We have made contributions to our field for decades. So when we find ourselves like dismissed, and they'll do that to anyone, you're suddenly fringe.
Touted as a miracle prevention and cure by far-right commentators and anti-vaxxers.
I'm not, although I've been characterized as a right-wing Proud Boy. This is a bipartisan issue, and the physicians represented here are truly a bipartisan group.
Our lives started going sideways professionally. Paul started getting numerous complaints against him that he's never had in his career.
For the first time in my entire career, I could not be a doctor. I had to stand by idly. I had to stand by idly watching these people die.
The clip I just played comes from director Mickey Willis's fantastic documentary series, Plandemic, available at plandemicseries.com. Now, if you ask Wikipedia, and I'm about to blow some minds here, you'll learn that these documentaries are conspiracy theory videos that promote misinformation and feature discredited anti-vaccine activists. This is the same list of invective the pharma-controlled tech and media platforms use to discredit any doctor or scientist who speaks out against their organized corruption. It wasn't just the whistleblowing physicians who came under attack. When, in September 2021, the popular comedian and podcast host Joe Rogan announced he'd kicked COVID in just a few days using a cocktail of drugs including ivermectin, the global press, government, and pharmaceutical interests coalesced to denounce, vilify, and gaslight him. NPR, which has taken $3 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, jumped on the dog pile and deceptively insinuated that Rogan took horse-level doses. Per NPR, Joe Rogan has told his Instagram followers he has been taking ivermectin, a deworming veterinary drug formulated for use in cows and horses to help fight the coronavirus. The Food and Drug Administration has warned against taking the medication, saying animal doses of the drug can cause nausea, vomiting, and in some cases, severe hepatitis. But Rogan never took veterinary ivermectin paste. Rogan said he had talked with multiple doctors who advised him to take the drug. He followed their advice and got well remarkably quickly.
Turns out I got COVID. So we immediately threw the kitchen sink at it. All kinds of meds, monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin.
One of those drugs he mentioned, ivermectin, is something more often used to deworm horses.
Rogan later had Sanjay Gupta on his podcast and confronted him about Sanjay's network, CNN, and the lies they had told about ivermectin. Gupta is CNN's chief medical correspondent and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and even he acknowledged the ludicrousness of these outright lies.
We should talk about that.
That bothered you.
It should bother you, too. They're lying at your network about people taking human drugs versus drugs for veterinary...
Calling it a horse dewormer is not a flattering thing, I get that.
It's a lie.
They shouldn't have said that.
Why did they do that?
I don't know.
You're the medical guy over there.
Ivermectin can be a very effective medication.
Subsequent to the Sanjay Gupta episode, Rogan interviewed both doctors Peter McCullough and Robert Malone. Rogan's podcast averages about 11 million viewers per episode, while CNN's news anchor and former CIA employee Anderson Cooper typically receives about 238,000 views per episode. So naturally, his show's broad distribution posed an existential threat to the narrative pushed by the COVID cabal. Shortly after the Malone episode aired, a compilation video surfaced of Joe Rogan using the N-word 24 times across 12 years of the podcast. I in no way condone Rogan's use of this word, but to me the more important issue is that we keep seeing the established powers leveraging the woke movement and cancel culture to suppress the voices of anyone who speaks truth to power. And the timing of the Rogan video coming out relative to the airing of the interview looks to me to be anything but pure coincidence. Compromised organizations as the arbiters of truth. Further, here's how Google, the allegedly independent fact-checkers, and Wikipedia have all been corrupted by private interest to support the cabal's narrative.
See, the problem with all of this is the evidence is right in front of our face. And when confronted with evidence, we are told fact-checkers are somehow transcendent.
The pace of our modern world makes it nearly impossible for working people to research the events and policies that shape their lives. When seeking answers to life's most pressing questions, where do we go first? Google. Enter the subject, hit go, and there it is. Only what they want us to see. In today's culture of copy and paste journalism, it's common for hundreds of unrelated outlets to feature the exact same report. This is not the result of laziness. This is by design. When we see identical headlines across seemingly unrelated platforms, the logical mind concludes, well then, it must be true. The illusion that numerous news sources have arrived at the same conclusion gives us confidence to share the chosen narrative. And just like that, we become the unwitting pushers of propaganda. Search engines are the holy grail for those seeking to control the narrative.
Google is already more powerful in terms of its control over people's lives than almost every government on the planet.
As the most influential search engine in the world, through its ubiquitous reach, Google has more power to influence U.S. elections than any foreign nation.
You testified before this committee. You said in subsequent elections, Google and Facebook and Twitter and big text manipulation could manipulate as many as 15 million votes in a subsequent election?
And the methods that they're using are invisible. They're subliminal. They're more powerful than most any effects I've ever seen in the behavioral sciences, and I've been in the behavioral sciences for almost 40 years.
The blacklists is something that Google said didn't exist, and they testified that under oath.
And nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do. Now, me as an engineer, I just did a search on Google's internal search engine, and guess what I found? It had blacklisted search terms like cancer cures. Why is Google deciding what people can and cannot search for?
What was once an efficient tool for navigating the world of information is now a network for global surveillance, data collection, and social engineering. Now let's take a look at a few of the most commonly used fact checkers, beginning with Snopes. The husband and wife duo of David and Barbara Mickelson founded Snopes.com in 1995. They had no journalism background or training whatsoever. They built their fact-checking empire by using Google as their primary verifying source. The Mickelsons divorced in 2015. Barbara sued David for embezzling money that he had allegedly spent on prostitutes, as well as a lavish honeymoon with his new wife, who worked as an escort in Las Vegas before joining the Snopes cast of characters. In 2017, David Mickelson's new business partners filed a lawsuit accusing Mickelson of multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Snopes proclaims to be the internet's go-to source for discerning what is true and what is total nonsense. Yet one glance at their history of fact-free checking tells another story. When Dr. Mikovits claimed she was arrested without a warrant and jailed without a charge, Snopes rated her statement false. Had they bothered to explore the arrest documents, they would have seen that indeed there was neither a warrant nor signatures to officiate a charge, a fact that I confirmed with members of Dr. Mikovits' legal team.
Was there a search warrant?
No.
And was she ever charged?
No. Never charged with a crime.
100% correct. Judy has never been charged with any crime.
Facebook's fact-checking arm, PolitiFact, is owned by the Poynter Institute, which has received substantial funding from big pharma allies such as Google and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Like Snopes, PolitiFact has a history of misleading the public. In late January of 2019, PolitiFact, Snopes, and FactCheck.org raced to squash the notion that coronavirus and its treatments were patented. They reviewed only 3 of the 4,452 publicly available patents, which unmistakably show that SARS coronavirus detection and treatment have been widely patented by both the public and private sectors.
Facebook's founder pledged to the WHO, saying they would remove false claims and block exploitative ads.
They're working with the World Health Organization and with the NHS, so they have a hotline, if you like, from those official sources.
Wikipedia is the go-to destination for introductions to people, places, and things. Wikipedia is supported by the Wikimedia Foundation, a non-profit parent organization with a long history of politically tied funders. Many named, many anonymous. What exactly does a Wikipedia donor receive in exchange for their generosity? What What began as an unbiased open source platform is now weaponized to undermine the work and reputation of anyone deemed a threat to its stakeholders. And once they smear you, they lock you out for making corrections to your own bio. In summary, most independent fact-checkers are neither independent nor factual. Simply put, they are political spin machines.
The intelligence agencies, the media, and big tech. Big media and big tech's complicities in the COVID-19 conspiracy were unfortunately not just driven by greed for pharma advertising spend. The corporations in both the big media and big tech oligopolies have been compromised by the intelligence agencies. This relationship was first exposed in the 1960s, as discussed in Section C, and has only gotten deeper and more nefarious over the subsequent decades. To be clear, the intelligence suppression agency's deceit of the American public is illegal domestic espionage. They do not care and will gaslight anyone who flags this issue as conspiracy theorist alt-right criminals. Here's a segment from Plandemic discussing the entanglement of intelligence agencies and the media.
Since the invention of the printing press, there's been a battle to control disseminated information. In the early 1900s, oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller took control of every newspaper and news editor of his era. He became America's first billionaire, paving the way for the power-hungry ever since. Thus began the gold rush for the modern world's most precious resource, the narrative.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
During a Senate committee investigation, it was revealed that the CIA had been conducting a covert operation to infiltrate and control U.S. media. They called it Operation Mockingbird.
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals. Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks? This, I think, gets into the kind of details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Over 3,000 CIA contracted and trained operatives were placed in key positions within top media outlets. Posing as editors and journalists, these well-paid actors never dared to question the effect of their lies on the world beyond their cozy studio.
How often does the CIA manipulate the media in this way?
It goes beyond your wildest imagination. Setting up student organizations so they could draw radical students in. 5,000 university professors co-opted to help the CIA manipulate people's minds. Journalists in the U.S., including big-name journalists, co-opted to function routinely to help the CIA put out stories and biases to the world.
As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will.
It's a great brainwashing process to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations, I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
So how do we know that Operation Mockingbird still isn't in effect? Well, we don't.
As for big tech, here's RFK Jr. explaining how the intelligence suppression agencies have been involved since the early days of Silicon Valley. Wired magazine in 1993 became the central clearinghouse for mainstream news coverage of the burgeoning online ecosystem. Wire quickly earned notoriety as a clearinghouse for intelligence agency chatter. Prior to Wired, Mondo 2000, the Bay Area's original tech and culture magazine, reflected the progressive, idealistic viewpoints of many of the pioneer tech innovators. In contrast, Wire, which appropriated Mondo 2000's look and feel and no small number of its employees, glorified military and intelligence agency celebrities and corporate CEOs who happened to be clients of Nicholas Negroponte's MIT lab. Wired gained snowballing prominence in the early 2000s at the same time that the CIA launched its notorious investment firm In-Q-Tel to infiltrate the tech industry and put Silicon Valley on steroids with easy terms and government contracts. The defense and intelligence agencies had a beachhead in the tech industry from its birth. The Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, created the internet by building the ARPANET grid in 1969. DARPA is the Pentagon's angel investor and venture fund. In addition to creating the internet, DARPA developed GPS, stealth bombers, weather satellites, pilotless drones, and the M16 rifle. DARPA was perhaps the largest funder of gain-of-function research, outstripping even Dr. Fauci's NIH in some years. In 2017 alone, DARPA laundered at least $6.5 million through Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance to fund experiments at the Wuhan lab. DARPA funded additional gain-of-function experiments at Fort Detrick and other biosecurity research at Patel's laboratory at St. Joseph, Missouri. Beginning in 2013, DARPA also financed the key technologies for the Moderna vaccine. In 2002, DARPA set off a firestorm among human rights advocates from the left and right by creating a comprehensive data mining system under President Reagan's National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter. Public protests forced DARPA to scuttle the project, but critics have accused the agency of using the technology to help launch Facebook. By remarkable coincidence, DARPA shut down its Facebook-like project, LifeLog, a venture that involved MIT contractors, the very same month, February of 2004, that Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, just a 30-minute walk up the Charles River in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the campus of Harvard University. In 2010, DARPA's visionary director, Dr. Regina Dugan, moved to Google as an executive, and in 2016, she transferred to Google's competitor, Facebook, running a mysterious project called Building 8. In 2018, she moved again to run Wellcome Leap, a health technology breakthrough innovation project of Wellcome Trust. Her peregrinations offer another example of the incestuous links between big tech, big pharma, and the military and intelligence agencies. According to veteran CIA officer Kevin Shipp, Silicon Valley CEOs who accepted In-Q-Tel contracts would become some of the 4.8 million Americans subsequently pressured into signing CIA state secret contracts, which subject signatories to 20-year prison sentences, property forfeitures, and other draconian reprisals imposed by secret courts for even minor violations of arbitrary provisions, including admitting to signing the contract. Once he signs that secrecy agreement, that Silicon Valley entrepreneur is now functionally the indentured servant of the agency. It binds him and his company for life, and the agreement itself is classified. In short, the big media and tech oligopolies had no problem conspiring against and lying to people around the world because they have never served the people. They serve big pharma, they serve the intelligence agencies, and in turn, they all serve the most powerful master of all, big banking. The depth of the cabal's infiltration, the world revolutionary movement, and the Federal Reserve. Now that I've highlighted how big pharma and the intelligence agencies influence the tech and media platforms, we have to address the core of this cabal's power and who has really been pulling the strings over the past 250 years. Because at their core, the pharmaceutical cartel, the tech cartel, the media cartel, and the intelligence suppression agencies are all controlled by the same organization. This cabal works in a highly authoritative, compartmentalized, and secretive manner to obfuscate the fact that these tentacles are all part of one underlying octopus. To understand how this octopus became so powerful in America, we have to understand three organizations you may have never heard of, but you will. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission. Before we discuss those, we have to first understand the Federal Reserve System, arguably the cabal's single most important controlled organization. And to understand the origins of the Federal Reserve, we have to start with an 18th century man from Frankfurt named Meyer Amschel Bauer, who later changed his name to Meyer Amschel Rothschild. The Rothschild family and the World Revolutionary Movement. I started this essay mentioning that the cabal's base of control stems from, number 1, control of the economic system, number 2, control of the global energy grid, and number 3, control of how people perceive reality. As it relates to controlling our perception of reality, the elites have always done so through their ownership of the media, be it the printing press, radio, television, or newspaper. That perception control extended into tech over the past 30 years as Silicon Valley developed and this cabal infiltrated the most important companies. As it relates to control of the economic system and the global energy grid, the cabal was able to cement their power back in 1913 through the formation of the U.S. Federal Reserve System. This brought the most powerful banking families of Europe, most importantly the Rothschild family, together with the most powerful industrialist families of America, most importantly the Rockefellers. Since that time, this cabal has used their control of the U.S. dollar, hard assets like gold, and many of the other fiat currencies in the world to establish a global corporatocracy that is deeply corrupt. This kleptocratic system ensures wealth disproportionately accrues to the elites at the expenses of the masses, always, time and time and time and time again. Before I go further, I wanted to highlight that we are now getting to the core of the conspiracy. Because of the importance of secrecy to this cabal's master plan, anyone who criticizes the banking families that forced the creation of the Fed has come under the harshest of censorship and vitriol, most commonly by being accused of anti-Semitism. In fact, the cabal has many times used this invective to shut down legitimate researchers and whistleblowers, while at other times has distorted the truth to increase anti-Semitic sentiments against target populations. I expect these accusations of anti-Semitism will be coming from me someday soon. So let me be perfectly clear here. Fundamental to Jewish philosophy is the concept that to save a life is to save the world. Men in this organization like Meyer Amschel Rothschild, Nathan Meyer Rothschild, James de Rothschild, Paul Warburg, Jakob Schiff, Henry Kissinger, and George Soros have great disdain for the lives of individuals, and their only concern is their personal accumulation of wealth and power. These men are not Jewish. They represent the inversion of all the principles upon which Judaism stands. The same goes for men like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Alan Dulles, George H.W. Bush, and Dick Cheney, who are not Christians but rather represent the inversion of Christian principles. The men responsible for this cabal have been able to silence their critics by false accusations of anti-Semitism. They have taken a philosophy of evil as their founding principle, and unfortunately this is not hyperbole. If I was some kind of conspiracy theorist, I'd think the religion of these men would be more appropriately considered Satanism. A lot of the research in this section comes from Eustace Mullen's book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Mullen spent 30 years between the 1950s to 1980s writing and updating his exposure of the organized crime syndicate that created the Federal Reserve and how they used their enormous wealth to orchestrate and finance both sides of every subsequent war. Now, if you look at Mr. Mullen's Wikipedia page, it is quite the doozy. In the summary alone, we learn that Mr. Mullins was a white supremacist, anti-Semitic, conspiracy theorist, propagandist, and Holocaust denier who the Southern Poverty Law Center described as a one-man organization of hate. There are a few possibilities here about Eustace Mullins and the motivations behind his writing career. First, he is a vicious anti-Semite who has made up bold-faced lies to disparage members of the Jewish faith, and in doing so, hurting the Jewish community more broadly. Number two, his life researching the Fed's origins brought him to some unpleasant truths about the men behind this conspiracy who claimed to be of Jewish faith. These revelations in turn drove Mr. Mullins to extremism and stereotyping of all legitimate members of the Jewish faith. Or number three, Mullins was a legitimate investigative journalist with integrity who was not at all anti-Semitic. Rather, the wealthy elites he spent a lifetime exposing used the full force of the organizations they controlled to smear, censor, and vilify Mullins. I'm also open to the possibility that Eustace Mullins was a nuanced human being and that there were numerous motivations driving him at various points in his life. All I can say is that in my own reading of Mullen's book, I did not once encounter anything that came off as white supremacist, anti-Semitic, or denying of the Holocaust. The words Jew and Jewish didn't appear at all in the 211-page book. Instead, what I found was a well-researched, well-cited accounting of the formation of this global cabal. The cabal in its current manifestation can be traced back to Meyer Amschel Bauer, born in Frankfurt in 1743. Bauer started a small business as a coin dealer, on which he hung a red shield over his door to advertise his business, and he subsequently adopted the name Rothschild, German for Red Shield. Rothschild was entrusted with investing the money of the Elector of Hesse, and he produced an excellent profit for both himself and the Elector, subsequently attracting other accounts. In 1773, Rothschild invited 12 other wealthy and influential men to meet with him in Frankfurt. His purpose was to convince them that if they agreed to pool their resources, they could then finance and control the world revolutionary movement and use it as their manual of action to win control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. On Substack, I've included the 25 points Rothschild laid out in his manual of action in the appendix. While this plan of action is absolutely horrifying, reading it helped to shine a light on the monstrosities that have occurred and continue to occur in the world. For example, the first point was laid out as follows. The speaker, Rothschild, started to unfold the plot by saying that because the majority of men were inclined to evil rather than to good, The best results in governing them could be obtained by violence and terrorism and not by academic discussions. The speaker reasoned that in the beginning human society had been subject to brutal and blind force, which was afterwards changed to law. He argued that law was force only in disguise. He reasoned it was logical to conclude that by the laws of nature, right lies in force. A couple other points in his manual of action were particularly relevant for the COVID-19 false flag, which to me highlights that the recent pandemic was far from the first time this group of conspirators have run such a nefarious plot. These other points include, number 2, he next asserted that political freedom is an idea and not a fact. He stated that in order to usurp political power, all that was necessary was to preach liberalism so that the electorate, for the sake of an idea, would yield some of their power and prerogatives, which the plotters could then gather together into their own hands. Point 7, he next advocated the use of mob psychology to obtain control of the masses. He reasoned that the might of the mob is blind, senseless, and unreasoning, and ever at the mercy of suggestion from any side. He stated only a despotic ruler can rule the mob efficiently because without absolute despotism, there can be no existence for civilization which was carried out not by the masses but by their guide, whosoever that person might be. He warned the moment the mob seizes freedom in its hands, it quickly turns to anarchy. Number 12, he next dealt with administration. He told those present that they must use their wealth to have candidates chosen for public office who would be servile and obedient to our commands, so they may readily be used as pawns in our game by the learned ingenious men we will appoint to operate behind the scenes of government as official advisors. He added, the men we appoint as advisors will have been bred, reared, and trained from childhood in accordance with our ideas to rule the affairs of the whole world. Number 13, he dealt with propaganda and explained how their combined wealth could control all outlets of public information while they remained in the shade and clear of blame, regardless of what the repercussions might be due to the publications of libels, slanders, or untruths. The speaker said, thanks to the press, we have got gold in our hands, notwithstanding the fact that we had to gather it out of the oceans of blood and tears. Following the formation of this master plan, Rothschild sent his 5 sons out to establish banking branches in the principal cities of Europe, the most successful ones being James Day Rothschild in Paris and Nathan Meyer Rothschild in London. Nathan Rothschild, by using a successful pump-and-dump strategy to manipulate the market, was able to gain nearly £1 million sterling following the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After his success from the Waterloo scam, Nathan Meyer Rothschild was able to gain control of the Bank of England through his enormous monopoly of consols and other shares. This gave the House of Rothschild tremendous influence over the global economic system, as Nathan Rothschild's control of the Bank of England enabled him to manipulate the price of gold. Rothschild later proclaimed, I care not which puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply. As the Rothschilds grew in power in Europe, a considerable anti-Rothschild movement grew due to the family's malicious and deceptive banking practices. The family's coup de grace was to expand their influence into the growing American economy through representatives not known to be Rothschild agents. For example, in 1836, Andrew Jackson came after the bankers attempting to renew the Second Bank of the United States, saying, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be revolution in the morning." While Nicholas Biddle was president of the Second Bank of the United States, it is well known that James Day Rothschild of Paris was the principal investor in this central bank. Although Jackson had vetoed the renewal of the charter of the bank, he probably was unaware that a few months earlier, in 1835, the House of Rothschild had cemented a relationship with the United States government by superseding the firm of Baring as financial agent of the Department of State on January 1st, 1835. In retaliation for Jackson's allowing the Second Bank Charter to expire, the Bank of England, under the control of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, aggravated the Panic of 1837 by throwing out all of the paper connected with the United States. Over the next 20 years, the Rothschild family developed ties with the Morgan family, first Junius S. Morgan and then his son John Pierpont J.P. Morgan. The Morgan family became the most important partner of the Rothschild influence in America, and the two families in 1857 helped to orchestrate another panic by significantly contracting credit. While over 900 American companies went bankrupt during this panic, the elder Morgan and his partner George Peabody received a $5 million loan from the Bank of England to save their company, an enormous sum at the time which no other firm received. Having this massive cash influx during a time when the market was highly depressed enabled Peabody and Morgan to purchase bonds from distressed investors and resell them at a huge profit once sanity had returned to the market. We see this exact same trend in every subsequent financial crisis, where the largest companies are able to consolidate competitors at pennies on the dollar. This in turn strengthens their monopolistic powers and tightens the grip of control of global power held by the few ultra-wealthy elites. On February 5th, 1891, the Round Table Group was formed in London between Cecil Rhodes of the Rhodes Scholarship, Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, the grandson of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, Lord Rosebery, the Rothschild-in-law, and Lord Corazon. The group's American interests were represented by J.P. Morgan. After World War I, the Round Table became known as the Council on Foreign Relations in the U.S. and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. The leading members of the governments of both England and the U.S. have been chosen from these organizations ever since. Following the formation of the Round Table, this cabal orchestrated the Panic of 1907. 3 years later, 8 men met in secret on Jekyll Island to concoct the structure for what became the Federal Reserve System. These men were Senator Nelson Aldrich, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., Aldrich's private secretary Arthur Shelton, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, Henry Davison, Senior Partner of J.P. Morgan Company and J.P. Morgan's personal emissary, Charles Norton, President of First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, another J.P. Morgan lieutenant, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who became one of the initial members of the Fed Board of Governors and the second vice chair of the Federal Reserve System. All the men and firms represented at this meeting had ties tracing back to the Morgan and/or Rothschild families. The Federal Reserve is today arguably the most important organization controlled by the cabal. Its development and influence has been supported by other cabal-controlled organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission, members of which today are prominent in every major media and tech corporation. The Federal Reserve, the CFR, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission. Officially, the Federal Reserve is the central banking system of the United States, controlling the money supply of the world's reserve currency, the US dollar, and setting interest rates. The CFR is an American think tank specializing in US foreign policy and international relations, founded in 1921. The Bilderberg Group, or Bilderberg Meeting, is an annual, off-the-record conference established in 1954 to foster dialogue between Europe and North America. The Trilateral Commission is a non-governmental international organization aimed at fostering closer cooperation between Japan, Western Europe, and North America, founded in 1974. Unofficially, critics allege that the true intentions of these organizations are much more nefarious. The Federal Reserve System was developed following the Jekyll Island meeting, culminating with passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This cartel of private banking families is believed to be at or near the core of the cabal's power today. While ownership data of the Fed system is difficult to ascertain, research indicate 80% of the New York Federal Reserve, by far the most powerful of the 12 U.S. Federal Reserve banks, is today owned by just 8 families. In the U.S., the Goldman Sachs, Rockefellers, Lehmans, and Kuhn Loebs, and in Europe, the Rothschilds, Warburgs, Lazards, and Mosesifs. On Substack, I've included a political cartoon from 1912 arguing against the creation of the Fed, as it would result in an octopus monster that controls the White House, Congress, U.S. Treasury, commercial banks, Wall Street, farming, and industry. This is exactly what has happened over the subsequent 110 years. According to Mullins, the first task of the Federal Reserve would be to finance World War I. The European nations were already bankrupt because they had maintained large standing armies for almost 50 years, a situation created by their own central banks, and therefore they could not finance a war. A central bank always imposes a tremendous burden on the nation for rearmament and defense in order to create an indistinguishable debt, simultaneously creating a military dictatorship and enslaving the people to pay the interest on the debt which the bankers have artificially created. The men in control of the Fed went on to orchestrate, second, the agricultural depression of 1920, third, the Black Friday crash on Wall Street of October 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression, fourth, World War II, fifth, the conversion of the assets of the United States and its citizens from real property to paper assets from 1945 to the present, transforming a victorious America and foremost world power in 1945 to the world's largest debtor nation. This strategy traces back to point 17 of Meyer Amschel Rothschild's 1773 Manual of Action. Point 17. Rothschild explained how industrial depressions and financial panics could be brought about and used to serve their purpose, saying, enforced unemployment and hunger imposed on the masses because of the power we have to create shortages of food will create the right of capital to rule more surely than it was given to the real aristocracy and by the legal authority of kings. He claimed that by having their agentur control the mob could then be used to wipe out all who dared to stand in their way. The financial policies directed by the Fed's Board of Governors and the Federal Reserve Advisory Council have, as of September 2022, burdened the U.S. economy with over $30 trillion of debt and inflation rates at 8.3%. In the decades after the Fed's creation, this corrupt octopus spread its tentacles into NGOs like the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and World Trade Organization to establish their desired kleptocratic economic structure under the lies of free market capitalism. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded in 1921, with Rockefeller and Morgan instrumental in its creation and financing. Critics allege that this organization has actively infiltrated the highest levels of U.S. government, both Republican and Democrat, as well as career bureaucrats, military and intelligence officers, and titans across all sectors of industry. These representatives have corrupted both major U.S. political parties and convinced the public that they are getting two choices by hyper-polarizing politics. These conspirators then divide the country and focus media attention on specific issues while their true agenda is allowed to play in the shadows. The agenda always works to the benefit of the powerful elites at the expense of the American public. The Bilderberg Group, started in 1954 by Prince Bernhard of the Dutch royal family, takes place annually amongst leaders in North America and Europe. The conference notoriously does not allow any minutes or recordings of the discussions. The only journalists allowed to attend are those handpicked by the steering committee. These meetings have been widely covered by investigative journalist and former military counterintelligence operative Daniel Estulin, or conspiracy theorist Daniel Estulin if you ask Wikipedia. Estulin has argued that one of the main agendas coordinated by the Bilderberg Group is to keep the world in a perpetual state of war. Why would they want perpetual war? Because this cabal controls the financial services organizations that lend money to both sides, the military and armaments industry that supplies the weaponry, and the energy and food corporations whose prices skyrocket when supply chains are disrupted during conflict. Meanwhile, these ongoing conflicts help to keep the general population in a state of perpetual fear, making it easier to control them, to steal money from them, and to convince them to abrogate civil liberties. This traces back to the Rothschilds' Manual of Action, Point 11. He next expounded his theories regarding war. In 1773, he set down a principle which the governments of Britain and the United States publicly announced as their joint policy in 1939. He said it should be the policy of those present to foment wars, but to direct the peace conferences so that neither of the combatants obtained territorial gains. He said the wars should be directed so that the nations engaged on both sides would be placed further in their debt and in the power of our agenturs. I hope you're starting to get a picture of the true nature of the men and women running our world. The Trilateral Commission was formed by John D. Rockefeller's grandson, David Rockefeller, in 1973. Critics allege this organization has been leveraged as a way to extend the CFR's influence across governments in Europe and East Asia as well as the US. Now, I want to be clear that I'm certainly not saying everyone in these organizations is corrupt or that they are even aware of the extent of the corruption in which these groups are connected. Rather, these cabal-controlled organizations all operate in highly secretive, compartmentalized, and authoritative cultures. So, while many of them know pieces of the overall corruption, very few know the full extent of the deception. They do all know that when the boss tells you to stop asking questions, you stop asking questions. These cabal-led organizations operate in a general hierarchy of evil at the top, corrupt in the middle, and incompetent at the bottom. So we have to be careful before alleging specific actions or involvement in any illegal activities by members simply due to their membership of these groups. That said, I expect as more of the truth comes out about this organized crime syndicate, you'll see its members dashing to the bottom of the pyramid and claiming ignorance. On Substack, I've included 2 charts put together by Swiss Policy and Research. The first shows the infiltration of the CFR, Bilderberg Group, and Trilateral Commission into the leadership teams of the American media. This chart reflects 190 of America's top media executives and journalists, many of whom are household names. The second highlights the CFR specifically and many of the powerful positions its members have occupied. This includes 8 U.S. presidents, 8 vice presidents, 17 CIA directors, 3 of the 7 members of the Warren Commission, which investigated the JFK assassination, and 7 members of the 9/11 Commission. The further down the rabbit hole you go, the more urgent and profound the implications become. I understand how unbelievable and conspiratorial all of this sounds, so I can understand if you'd prefer to dismiss this entire essay out of disbelief. All I can do is recommend you investigate the sources I've cited and see if you reach a different conclusion. We have to accept the uncomfortable truth that there is a cabal at the center of world power, directing the planet with self-serving, sociopathic intent. Until we do so, the situation is going to continue to get worse. The $100 trillion question is, of course, who is in control of this cabal today? In 1992, Eustace Mullins identified the Council of Five in control of the New World Order. First, Baron Guy de Rothschild, the great-grandson of James de Rothschild. Guy died in 2007, so his seat would have most likely transferred to another member of the James Rothschild family. 2. Evelyn de Rothschild, the great-great-grandson of Nathan Meyer Rothschild. Evelyn is still alive as of September 2022. 3. George Pratt Schultz, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, who also served on the board of directors of the fraudulent pharmaceutical company Theranos and was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Schultz passed away in 2021. 4. Robert Russa, Treasury Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs during the Kennedy administration. Russa also served as director of the Council on Foreign Relations, trustee in the Rockefeller Foundation, and a member of the Trilateral Commission. Russa passed away in 1993. And 5th, one vacancy at the time of Mullins' writing. Mullins also noted that members of the council who had died in recent years included Averell Harriman, Lord Victor Rothschild, and Prince Thurn Taxis of Regensburg, Germany. I have no idea if Mullins' research is accurate regarding the top of this pyramid of evil, but it seems to me a good place to start looking as we expose this cabal once and for all. It's time we Voldemort these men who must not be named and recognize the people in charge of this crime syndicate as the ridiculous clowns that they are. Finally, I'd like to wrap up this first part of the outro with some thoughts on how the economy actually works. To start, almost no one in the world understands how the economy works, including regulators, bankers, and investors. This is done intentionally. The cabal benefits by the opaqueness of the financial system because the way the economy actually works is so criminal. Here are 7 points to highlight. First, the cabal controls the most important hard assets, including gold through their control of the Bank of England, and fiat currencies. Fiat currencies mean currencies backed by paper, also meaning backed by nothing. Fiat currencies like the USD and the euro are controlled through their ownership of the Federal Reserve System and the European Central Bank. Fiat currencies like the Chinese renminbi and the Russian ruble are controlled by totalitarian regimes, which at their core are also just pawns of this same underlying cabal. 2, by controlling the supply of all the most important currencies, these banks can then create credit and charge interest on the paper money they've created out of nothing. 3, whenever they issue new credit, the buyers of this credit are commercial banks, asset managers, and Fortune 1000 corporations, which they also own. Those corporations then have immediate purchasing power before prices have adjusted, so they can spend this money at pre-inflation prices. 4th, by the time the money printed trickles its way through the economy to the individual consumer, prices have adjusted and our purchasing power has been reduced by inflation. 5th, meanwhile, because this cabal controls the supply of money, interest rates, and has the vast majority of global wealth under management, they can orchestrate financial crises whenever it suits them to pull the rug out from the economy, such as in 2008 towards the very end of George W. Bush's presidency. All the while, the bankers collect higher amounts of interest on an increasing quantum of debt. 6, in these depressed points in market cycles, cabal-controlled corporations can buy up competitors for pennies on the dollar, while also using their pawns in government to justify bailouts that transfer money from the public to the banks. And 7, these financial crises are often coordinated in tandem with other disasters, including food shortages, energy supply disruptions, geopolitical conflict, and/or global pandemics. These additional triggers increase the public's fear and willingness to give up civil liberties, as well as to transfer tax dollars to multinational corporations for emergency use. And this is the same playbook we've seen repeat again and again as wealth and power consolidates in fewer and fewer hands. This concludes the first half of the outro, COVID-19 corruption, the destruction of public health, and ideas to regenerate it. Please join me in episode 32 as we conclude this 3-part podcast series. In episode 32, we'll round out the timeline of COVID corruption, highlighting Maddie to Garay's story and the systemic suppression of vaccine-injured patients, both during clinical trials and then following the global rollout. I'll then proceed to part 3 of this essay, where we discuss Bill Gates, Tony Fauci, and the Federal Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act. In part 4, I'll argue that the corruption of Big Pharma goes even further than what we've discussed today, to the suppression of valid scientific theories in favor of theories that are known to be false. First, the suppression of miasma theory in favor of germ theory. Second, the suppression of holistic medicine in favor of Western or allopathic medicine. And third, the suppression of a consciousness-based cosmology in favor of an atheistic, materialistic cosmology. I'll then end the essay in part 5 with some parting words for Maddie and Garay. Thank you.
Heart of the summer, now we're all in the south, cause the planet is burning, same within as without. You know desire is urgent, bigger than doubt. I gotta drive to you quickly, can't walk to your house. Can't stop, can't cool it down, we're too far to quit when you start. It's hot like new stars, and jump like used cars. Go dumb, but who's smart? Oh, forgive me, Lord. My reckless admissions, I see his wisdom we're missing, and it's late. And I see the look in those eyes and lose faith. I got the flame in my toes, I can't wait. Do the dance that I know, though I know it ain't safe. Can't help it. If a plane was crashing, would you hold someone or fold your hand? Say, help me, help me. You and I go right with the brakes off, yeah, yeah. You and me with the whole world outside, yeah. Turn the phones off, saying don't stop, like it's safe to go and fly into the flame. Shut the front door, lock it before the bill comes knocking. We'll spend our time like humans do. Can't hold back a rocket, just hold on and watch it. So holding on's just what we do. It's a vibe, it's a mode. We entwine, we enclose. We can shine, we can glow or incinerate. I'm in tide, I'm exposed. We combine, we corrode. We don't ever keep it light on our dinner dates. It's a cycle that our energy feeds. I got gaps, I got goals, I got energy needs. Love the fighter in you, but when your enemies meet, I get fired up, tired out, offended in me. Got lots to lose, lots to prove. Thoughts and views, costs and dues. Our bodies wanna integrate. Watch news, feel like we ought to move. Do what we gotta do, cause Shiva's gonna shimmy shake. Had a dream of the end of the line. We were running through the city with the henchmen behind. With your hand in my hand, one purpose in mind. Stay together in effort, just extending our time. If a plane was crashing, would you hold someone or fold your hand? Say help me, help me. You and I go right with the brakes off, yeah, yeah. You and me with the whole world outside, yeah. Turn the phones off, saying don't stop, like it's safe to go and fly into the flame. Shut the front door, lock it before the bill comes knocking. We'll spend our time like humans do. Can't hold back a rocket, just hold on and watch it. So holding on's just what we